Hey, welcome back. Come on in, get comfortable, grab your blanket, turn the lights down low, and just settle in for a little while. Tonight I want to take you somewhere. Not a place you can visit with a plane ticket, more like a place you can only reach by closing your eyes and listening very carefully. I want to take you to Europe, around the year 1700 and something. And I want to introduce you to someone you've never met but who in some strange and quiet way you might already know. She wakes up before the sun does. She doesn't have an alarm clock, she has cold floors and the sound of the household stirring around her. She doesn't check her phone because there is no phone. There's just the weight of the day ahead settling onto her chest like a stone before she's even fully awake. And here's what I find so haunting about that image. She could be a duchess in Paris. She could be a farmer's wife in the German countryside. She could be a maid scrubbing a hearth in London before her employer's family rises for breakfast. The details of her morning are wildly different, but that feeling, that weight, that quiet sense of here we go again, that part was the same for almost all of them. Tonight we're going to spend some time with the women of 18th century Europe. Not the ones painted on ceilings or immortalized in marble. Not the queens, or at least not only the queens. I mean the full picture. The messy, complicated, surprisingly funny, sometimes heartbreaking full picture of what it actually meant to be a woman in that time. And I promise you by the time we're done you're going to see something unexpected. Because the more I've learned about these women, the more I've realized that the things they wrestled with are not as far away as we'd like to think. Let's start the very beginning. Not with what they did, but with what they were. If you were born a girl in Europe in the year 1700, your identity was essentially handed to you before you could speak. Not chosen, assigned. And I don't just mean your name. The law in nearly every country across the continent treated a woman as a kind of legal appendage. In England, there was a doctrine called coverture, which basically meant that the moment a woman married, she ceased to exist as a separate legal person. Her property became her husband's. Her earnings became her husband's. Even her body in many interpretations of the law was considered under his authority. She didn't disappear physically, obviously, but she vanished from the paperwork entirely. Legally speaking, she and her husband were one person, and that person was him. Now I know that sounds extreme, and it was. But here's the thing that gets me: this wasn't a secret. It wasn't hidden in some dusty legal footnote. It was openly taught, openly defended, openly celebrated as the natural order of things. The philosopher William Blackstone, one of the most respected legal minds of the 18th century, wrote about coverture with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use to describe gravity, as if women simply not existing in law was just the way the world worked. And most women had never been told anything different, so they didn't question it. How do you question something you've never been given a word for? Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because Europe in 1700 wasn't one monolithic thing. If you were a woman in France, your experience looked different from a woman in England. And her experience was different from a woman in the Italian states or in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or in a small village in the Netherlands. The continent was a patchwork of laws, customs and expectations, and your daily reality was shaped almost entirely by where and into which family you happened to be born. A daughter of the French aristocracy, for instance, would have had almost no formal legal independence, but she might have had enormous social power. The culture of Versailles and the grand houses that tried to imitate it was in many ways a world where women set the tone. They hosted the salons. They managed the relationships. They whispered in the right ears. It wasn't power on paper, but it was power in practice. And any honest historian will tell you the two are not always the same thing. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, and I want you to really sit with this for a second, a peasant woman in rural Bavaria, or a textile worker in Lyon, or a fishwife in the markets of Amsterdam, had a different kind of survival to think about entirely. She wasn't worrying about social currency. She was worrying about whether there'd be enough food when the harvest was bad, whether she'd make it through her next pregnancy, whether her children would live to see age 5. That last one is something I think we genuinely don't sit with enough. In the pre-industrial period, roughly between the years 1600 and 1800, the lifetime risk of a married woman dying during or shortly after childbirth was approximately 1 in 18. 1 in 18. To put that in some kind of modern context that's comparable to the maternal mortality rate in parts of sub-Saharan Africa at the turn of the 21st century. Developed world Europe in the year 2000 had a rate of roughly 1 in 2,400. We're talking about a risk 50 times higher than what women in wealthy countries face today. And this wasn't some abstract statistic to the women living it. Every single woman who became pregnant knew someone, a neighbour, a sister, a cousin, a friend who had not survived. Childbirth wasn't a medical event managed by professionals in a sterile room. It was a gathering of women in a dim bedroom attended by a midwife who'd learned her skills by watching other midwives surrounded by prayer and fear, and the very real possibility that morning would not come for everyone in that room. The most common killers were puerperal fever, what we now call childbed fever, a bacterial infection that could take hold within days of delivery, as well as hemorrhage and obstructed labour. And because no one yet understood how infection spread, well-meaning hands became instruments of death. It would not be until the middle of the 19th century that a Hungarian physician named Ignác Semmelweis would begin to figure out that unwashed hands were killing mothers, and even then the medical establishment resisted his findings for years, because the idea that doctors were causing death was too uncomfortable to accept. So when I say that ordinary women in the 18th century had an extraordinary kind of courage, I mean it literally. Getting pregnant was for many of them knowingly walking toward a door that might not open from the other side. And most of them did it not once, not twice, but 7, 8, 9 times over the course of their lives. I find that almost unbearable to think about, and yet I also find it deeply, profoundly moving. Because here's what those women did not do. They did not stop. They did not give up on the idea of family, of continuity of love, even when love had a price tag that we can barely imagine. There was a resilience operating quietly inside the everyday lives of these women that rarely made it into the history books, because history has never been particularly interested in survival that doesn't involve a sword. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want to paint all of 18th century womanhood as a single grey portrait of suffering. That would be just as inaccurate as pretending it was all Rococo parties and silk fans, which it absolutely was not. The truth, as it always is more textured than either extreme, because within the constraints of their world, and those constraints were real and heavy and often cruel, women were building lives. Full, complex, sometimes joyful lives. They were forming friendships of startling intimacy. They were finding meaning in faith. They were laughing at things we would still find funny today. They were reading the first novels, which were a brand new form in the early 1700s, were consumed hungrily by women across England and France. They were writing letters, and some of those letters are so alive, so sharp and witty and warm, that reading them now feels like eavesdropping on a conversation that was never meant to end. There's something I keep coming back to, and I think it's important, the gap between what a woman was allowed to be and what a woman actually was internally, intellectually, emotionally. That gap was enormous. And the women who navigated it most brilliantly were the ones who figured out how to be fully themselves in the spaces between the rules. That's the story I want to tell tonight. Not the rules, the spaces between them. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer out loud, just let it sit in the back of your mind as we keep going. If you had been born a woman in Europe in 1700, no vote, no legal identity, no career, no choice about who you married, what would you have done with the interior life they couldn't take away from you? What would you have done with the part of you that was still entirely stubbornly yours? Keep that question close, because in the coming sections we're going to meet women who answered it in some of the most fascinating ways you can imagine. We're about to step into the world of marriage, which in the 18th century was less a love story and more a very high-stakes negotiation with a human being as the prize. And I'll warn you now, some of what you're about to hear is going to make you grateful, deeply grateful to live in the time you do. But some of it might also quietly make you wonder how much has actually changed. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and maybe you have too without quite putting it into words, is how much of our lives are shaped by decisions that were made for us long before we were old enough to have an opinion. Where we grew up, what kind of family we were born into, what people around us believed love was supposed to look like. For women in 18th century Europe, that question wasn't abstract. It was a legal document, a dowry negotiation, a name signed at the bottom of a contract often before the ink was even dry on a woman's own understanding of herself. Marriage in this era was at its core a transaction, and I don't mean that cynically. I mean it in the most literal sense possible. It involved land money, family reputation, political alliances, heirs' inheritance rights, and sometimes the fate of entire estates spanning multiple generations. Romance, if it showed up at all, was considered a pleasant bonus, the kind of thing nice families hoped for, but would never let stand in the way of a good match. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked. In England, France, Germany, and across most of the continent, a daughter was from the moment of her birth a kind of family asset. Not cruelly, not deliberately, just structurally. The same way a field or a mill or a title was an asset. She had value, and that value was most efficiently realized through her marriage. From the time a girl of means was old enough to walk into a drawing room without tripping over her skirts, she was being prepared. Not for a career, not for independence. She was being prepared for a presentation, a social performance that would demonstrate her worth to the families who might consider a union. Could she play the harpsichord? Could she speak French with a passable accent? Could she manage a household, hold a conversation, and look appropriately modest while doing both? At the same time, these were not frivolous accomplishments. They were credentials, the 18th century equivalent of putting your best qualifications on a document, except the document in this case was a woman's entire visible self. And here's what I find genuinely fascinating and a little heartbreaking. About all of this, the women themselves understood the game. Most of them had watched their mothers play it. Most of them had no alternative framework to compare it to. So they learned the steps, they performed the steps, and many of them performed them brilliantly. But that doesn't mean they were happy about it. Let me introduce you to someone who was not happy about it, at least not privately, even if her public face never let on. Her name was Georgiana Spencer. You might know her better as Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. She was born in 1757 into one of England's most respected aristocratic families. She was witty, radiant, socially magnetic by all accounts, one of the most charming young women of her generation, and on her 17th birthday in June of 1774 she married William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire. On paper, this was a spectacular match. The Duke was one of the wealthiest men in Britain, with an annual income that reportedly exceeded £60,000, a figure so staggering that most people of that era couldn't have counted that high in their heads. He owned Chatsworth, one of the grandest country houses in all of England, Hardwicke Hall, Chiswick House, Lismore Castle, properties that stretched across counties, across landscapes, across centuries of accumulated power. What Georgiana got was the title, the position, the social standing, the ability to lead fashion across an entire nation, to host the most influential political salon in London, to be painted by Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough, the two greatest portrait artists of the age. What she did not get was a husband who particularly cared about her. The Duke was famously cold, reserved to the point of barely being present. He already had a mistress before the wedding, and he preferred the company of his dogs to conversation with his new wife. Georgiana, 17 years old, stepping into the largest role of her life, found herself married to a man who met her warmth with polite indifference and little else. And yet, she couldn't leave, couldn't say no, couldn't renegotiate the terms after the fact. The deal had been struck, the settlement had been signed, and now she was the Duchess of Devonshire, and that was simply what she was. What Georgiana did next is something I think about often, because it tells us something important about what women of this era did when the doors in front of them were closed. She didn't shrink. She expanded sideways. She poured herself into politics, becoming the leading hostess for the Whig Party at a time when women couldn't even vote. She canvassed for candidates in the streets of Westminster. She built friendships of extraordinary depth. She had her heartbreaks too, a gambling addiction that buried her in debts she hid from her husband, for years a love affair that ended in exile. But she never disappeared. She never became merely an appendage to a man who didn't see her. I find her story both moving and infuriating in equal measure, and I think that's probably the right reaction. Now, Georgiana was at the very top of the social pyramid where the stakes were enormous, and everything was handled by lawyers and settlements and generations of family strategy. But the logic of the transaction wasn't limited to the aristocracy. It filtered all the way down. Even in middling families, merchants, tradesmen, minor landowners, a daughter's marriage was a matter of household strategy. The dowry might be a sum of cash rather than an estate. The negotiations might take place over dinner rather than in a solicitor's office. But the underlying principle was the same: a woman's future was something to be arranged, not something she chose for herself. And here's a detail that I think really captures the spirit of the era before the Marriage Act of 1753, an act that became known as Hardwicke's Act after the Lord Chancellor who championed it. Marriage in England was astonishingly informal by modern standards. As long as two people verbally consented to each other, in some interpretations they could be considered married. No church required, no witnesses required, no paperwork required, just two people saying yes. You might think, well, that sounds rather freeing, and in one sense it was for the people who wanted to escape their families' plans, which is exactly why it became a problem. In the 1740s alone, roughly 6,000 marriages per year in England were taking place in the area around Fleet Prison in London, a notorious neighbourhood that had become a kind of underground wedding factory. Debtors' priests, back-alley chapels, ceremonies conducted in taverns by men of questionable ordination, for a few shillings, no questions asked. One reverend was said to have conducted over 1,000 such marriages in a single year alone. For working-class couples who simply wanted to marry quickly and cheaply, this was practical. But for wealthy families watching their sons and daughters potentially slip off with unsuitable partners, or watching fortune hunters target vulnerable young heiresses, the Fleet was a nightmare. The 1753 Act sealed it all down. Suddenly every marriage had to be performed in a proper church after public announcement, with parental consent required for anyone under 21. Clergy who performed unauthorized marriages could be transported, effectively exiled, to a penal colony for 14 years. And here is the part that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The strongest voices against the Act in Parliament were those who argued it was cruel to women, that it handed control of a woman's most fundamental life decision, who she married, firmly back to her parents, which in practice meant firmly back to her father. One member of Parliament, Charles Townshend, called it exactly that, a cruel enterprise against women. He was right, and nobody listened. So what did a woman do if the marriage arranged for her was genuinely unbearable? The honest answer is mostly she endured. Divorce in the 18th century was not simply difficult. It was for most women practically impossible. To obtain an absolute divorce in England, a couple needed a private act of Parliament. You read that correctly. An actual act of law passed by Parliament on your specific behalf. This remedy was available only to the extraordinarily wealthy, and even then it was overwhelmingly sought by men, not women. Between 1700 and 1750, fewer than 20 such divorces were granted in England. Total, not per year, total in half a century. What this meant in practice was that a woman who found herself in a miserable or dangerous or simply loveless marriage had almost nowhere to go legally. She could separate from her husband, informally live apart if her circumstances allowed, but she remained legally his wife. His property remained hers only insofar as he permitted it. Her children belonged to him under the law, not to her. If she left without his agreement, she left with almost nothing. I want to sit with that for a second because I think we rush past it too quickly. Imagine knowing at 17 or 18 that the choice you were about to make or that was about to be made for you was functionally irreversible, that if it went wrong, the law offered you no exit, that the best you could hope for was a husband who was kind and the worst you could receive was a husband who was cruel, and in either case the legal situation was essentially the same. That was the reality. And yet, and I mean this genuinely, the picture isn't purely dark. Because within this system, something quietly remarkable was happening in the 18th century that represented a real if slow shift. The idea of marrying for affection, not just for property, not just for family strategy, but because two people actually wanted to be together, was beginning to take root. Hesitantly, controversially, but genuinely. In England, particularly writers and moralists and eventually novelists began to argue that a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine regard was not just more pleasant, it was more virtuous. The word that kept appearing in these discussions was companionship. The husband and wife as companions in life rather than merely legal and economic partners. This sounds obvious to us now. It was revolutionary then. The average age of first marriage for women in England crept upward through the century from the late teens in earlier generations toward the early to mid-20s by 1700. This matters because it suggests women were spending more of their young adulthood working, socializing, building a sense of self before being handed off to a husband. The gap was small, but the direction was meaningful. And in France, where the culture of romantic love had been celebrated in literature and songs for centuries, there was an interesting contradiction at work. French aristocratic marriages were perhaps the most strategically arranged in all of Europe. And yet French culture produced some of the most passionate defences of love, of feeling, of the interior life, of all the things that a purely contractual marriage left out. It's as if the culture kept dreaming of what the institution refused to deliver. Does that remind you of anything? I'll leave that thought where it lands. What I keep returning to as I think about all of these women, Georgiana and her cold duke, the anonymous young women waiting for their fathers' decisions in drawing rooms across the continent, the working-class girls married quickly in Fleet Prison taverns, is a question about agency. Because here is what I believe, and I've thought about it for a long time. The absence of formal power does not mean the absence of agency. These women were not passive. They were working within an extremely narrow space with whatever tools they had. Charm, intelligence, social skill, friendship, courage, sometimes writing, sometimes sheer stubbornness to carve out lives that were more than the contract said they had to be. Georgiana became the most politically influential woman of her generation without ever holding a single office. Thousands of unknown women built households, raised children, managed finances, held families together, and found joy, real specific documented joy inside lives that we might look at from the outside and call constrained. That tension between constraint and agency, between what the law allowed and what women actually did, that's the thread running through everything we're going to talk about tonight. Speaking of which, we've been living inside the drawing rooms and marriage negotiations long enough. It's time to step outside and look at what a day actually looked like. And I mean a full day from the cold floor at dawn to the candle snuffed out at night. Because the gap between how different women lived their hours was almost incomprehensibly wide, and how you spent your hours in this era said absolutely everything about who the world had decided you were. Let's find out. Close your eyes for a second. Actually, go ahead, I'll talk, you just listen. Picture a clock, not the kind on your phone. A real clock, the old kind with a face and hands. Now imagine that clock ticking not forward through time, but sideways across an entire continent, across 3 completely different lives happening on the exact same morning, the same year, the same season, the same hour just before dawn. 3 women open their eyes, and from that single shared moment their days unspool into something so different from each other that you'd be forgiven for thinking they inhabited separate planets entirely. That's what I want to do with you right now. I want to take you through a full day, one day lived through 3 very different women in 18th century Europe. Because if you want to understand what it truly meant to be a woman in this era, the daily rhythm is where it lives. Not in the big dramatic moments, not the marriages or the deaths or the political upheavals, but in the ordinary grinding, sometimes beautiful, sometimes exhausting texture of the hours. Let's start with the first woman. She lives in France somewhere within the gravitational pull of Versailles, in a great house with a proper staff and a dressing room that is frankly the size of a modest apartment. She's a woman of the upper aristocracy, not the queen, but someone who moves in those circles, who knows those circles, who has dedicated a not insignificant portion of her life to understanding exactly how those circles work. She does not wake up so much as she is prepared. It begins around 9 or 10 in the morning, late by any working person's standard, when her first lady's maid enters the bedchamber carrying what was called the morning offering, a selection of fresh linens, handkerchiefs, chemises laid out with the same ceremony you might expect at a state dinner. The curtains are drawn back. The room shifts from dim to grey to golden slowly. And then the real event of the morning begins. The toilette. Now here's something I want to make sure you understand, because I think it gets lost when people think about 18th century aristocratic women and their endless dressing rituals. The toilette was not simply vanity. It was not women being frivolous. It was in fact a kind of political theatre, a ritual that had been deliberately designed to display power, wealth, taste, and social standing all at once through the medium of getting dressed. The practice had been formalised at the French court starting with Louis XIV, who turned his own morning dressing ceremony into a spectacle attended by 100 courtiers. His mistresses and the great ladies of the court adopted the practice for themselves. By the mid-18th century, a wealthy aristocratic woman's morning toilette could last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, and it was crucially semi-public. Visitors were received, business was conducted, political conversations happened. All while a hairdresser worked on those extraordinary towers of powdered hair, all while maids applied the carefully blended lead-white foundation that made a woman's complexion fashionably pale, all while someone else selected the gown from a book of fabric samples, because yes, such books existed with 12 full dress options for each season, and the lady would mark her choices with a pin. Marie Antoinette herself, writing to her mother in 1770, described putting on her rouge and washing her hands in front of the whole world as casually as you might describe making coffee in the morning. The openness of it was the point. Privacy was for the poor. So our aristocratic Frenchwoman receives visitors at her dressing table. She writes a letter or two while her hair is being dressed. She settles a small dispute among her household staff. She decides which of 3 evening events she will attend tonight. She eats a delicate breakfast from a tray. By the time she's fully dressed, powdered, patched, and presented by the time her hair has been pinned and padded and elevated into something architectural, it is approaching noon. And her social day is just beginning. In the afternoon there are calls to pay and receive a practice so codified that it operated almost like a calendar system for the upper classes. You paid a visit to a friend. She returned the call within a set number of days. To fail to return a call promptly was a social statement. To be unavailable too many days running was a form of communication in itself. The drawing rooms of Paris operated as a complex information network, and the women who moved through them were the nodes through which ideas, alliances, gossip and influence travelled. In the evening, perhaps the theatre, perhaps a card game which could run until 2 or 3 in the morning without anyone finding it unusual. Perhaps a ball which was an event involving dancing, yes, but also negotiation, display, courtship by proxy political positioning, and the quiet, constant work of being seen in exactly the right light, talking to exactly the right people, at exactly the right moment. It sounds exhausting. It was exhausting. And yet there is something I find deeply compelling about it, because within the very narrow channel that society had assigned these women, they became astonishingly skilled. The management of social relationships at this level was a genuine intellectual art. The French women who ran the great salons, we'll talk more about them later, were doing something real, something difficult, something that shaped history, even if history has been slow to credit them for it. Now stay with me here, let's move. We're leaving Paris. We're crossing the Channel, landing in London, stepping into a merchant's townhouse in a respectable part of the city. It's a solid house, not a grand house. The family has a cook and a housemaid, 2 servants, which was considered comfortable but not lavish for their station. The husband works in trade, and our second woman, the merchant's wife, is awake considerably earlier than her aristocratic counterpart across the water. She's up by 6, maybe half past. There is no ceremony to the waking. She rises, dresses herself in practical clothes without much ceremony, her stays laced somewhat more loosely in the morning, and goes directly downstairs to consult with the cook about the day's meals. What needs to be purchased? What can be made from what's already in the house? The management of household provisions was a constant, detailed, genuinely demanding task. Food could not be stored indefinitely. Markets needed to be visited or goods ordered regularly. Seasonal availability shaped the menu as firmly as any choice. A competent merchant's wife held all of this in her head simultaneously, along with the household accounts, the linen inventory, the servants' wages, and the social calendar. Let me be direct about something here. Historians for a long time dramatically underestimated how much cognitive labour was involved in running an 18th-century household of any means. The merchant's wife wasn't merely cooking and cleaning. She was in many practical senses the operating director of a small enterprise. She hired and dismissed staff. She extended credit at the market. She managed the family's social obligations, the visits paid and received, the letters written, the relationships maintained with extended family and neighbours. If her husband ran a business, she was often deeply involved in its paperwork, its correspondence, sometimes its operation during his absences. Her mornings were dense with practical work. The housemaid required supervision. The cook required instruction. The children, and there were almost certainly several, required attention, feeding lessons, managing. By the time the household was running smoothly, it was already mid-morning, and our merchant's wife had been working for 3 or 4 hours without pause. In the afternoon, if she was lucky and organised and had no crisis to manage, she might claim an hour or 2 for herself. This is when you'd find women of her class reading, and they read voraciously. The novel was a brand new literary form in the 18th century, and middle-class women were its primary audience. Books were expensive to own. but circulating libraries where you paid a subscription to borrow spread through English towns from the 1740s onward, and women used them constantly. They read Pamela and Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, novels about women navigating the same social pressures they lived under every day. They read Tom Jones, and they passed copies to their friends, and they wrote each other letters about what they thought. This exchange of letters was itself a literary practice. Women in the 18th century wrote letters with a care and craft that we've largely lost, now treating them as a form of genuine creative expression. Tea was an afternoon ritual that had by the middle of the century become genuinely important to this class of woman. Not merely as a beverage, though. The English relationship with tea had by this point reached a level of devotion that bordered on the theological, but as a social practice. Receiving friends for tea was how you maintained your network. It was how information moved. It was how alliances were tested and strengthened and sometimes broken. A well-run tea was a small performance in the same way a great aristocratic salon was a large one. Different scales, same logic. By evening the household was fed, the children settled, the accounts perhaps reviewed. If her husband was home, there might be conversation cards reading aloud together. The 18th century had a strong culture of shared domestic reading. If he was not home, she might write those letters or simply sit with her needlework in the quiet that the day had finally earned her. Her day had been full. Her day had been useful. Her name is not in any history book. And now, the third woman. We're in the German countryside. The year is still 17-something. The harvest season is just ending, and the days are shortening. She lives in a stone farmhouse that is shared in the cold months with the family's livestock, not because the family is unusually poor, but because the warmth of the animals matters when winter in rural Germany arrives with serious intention. She is awake before the sun is. Not slightly before, measurably before the sky outside is still the colour of iron when she rises and begins lighting the fire. Her first task before anything else is warmth. Fire first, or nothing else works. About 80% of Europe's population in the 18th century still lived in rural areas doing broadly what people have been doing for generations before them. The pace of change in the countryside was dramatically slower than in the cities. If you were a peasant woman in the German countryside in 1750, your daily life bore more resemblance to the daily life of your great-grandmother than to anything a Parisian aristocrat would recognize. Her work is physical in a way that the other two women's work simply is not. She milks the cows before breakfast in the dark by feel and habit her hands, knowing the rhythm without needing her eyes. She feeds the chickens, she tends the kitchen garden if the season allows. She makes the bread, which means she has been managing the starter for days ahead of time, which means baking is not an event but a continuous process. She tends like a living thing. In the textile-producing regions of Europe and much of Germany and Flanders, was exactly that women also spent a significant portion of every day at the spinning wheel or the loom. Flax was grown, retted, spun, woven. The thread produced went to merchants and into markets beyond anything the family would wear themselves. Spinning was not a hobby. It was an economic activity that kept households solvent in the winters when the fields gave nothing. Peasant women carried their spindles with them. Historians have noted this repeatedly so that their hands would not be idle during any free moment of the day. Walking to the market, waiting for water, sitting by the fire in the evening, the spindle was almost an extension of the hand. Lunch, when it came, was whatever could be prepared quickly from what was available. Bread. Porridge made from whatever grain the family could afford. Root vegetables. The diet of rural Europe in the 18th century was monotonous by modern standards and calorie poor by the standards of the labour being performed. Historians studying the records of this period have noted that working peasant women were consistently undernourished relative to the work they were doing, and that in times of bad harvests, they were also consistently the last ones fed within their own households, prioritizing husbands and children over themselves. That detail sits with me. It's such a quiet form of sacrifice. No drama to it. Just a woman moving a little less food onto her own plate every day, because she'd calculated that someone else needed it more. Afternoon brought more of the same tending, mending, preparing, preserving. In autumn, the preservation work was urgent. Food put by now was food available in February. Women oversaw the salting, the pickling, the drying, the storing. If the pantry was not properly stocked before the first hard frost, there was no remedy for it. By evening, the family gathered in the kitchen, the warmest room, and the work continued. Spinning by firelight, mending, children's needs attended to, and then exhaustion. Simple, total, honest exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of too many dinner parties, but the exhaustion of a body that has genuinely spent everything it had, and will need to do it again in the morning. 3 women, 3 completely different days. And yet, and I keep coming back to this, all 3 of them were managing something. All 3 of them were running something. All 3 of them were deploying intelligence and skill and stamina in service of a life that the world around them largely did not bother to name. The aristocratic French woman's social manoeuvring was real work. The merchant's wife's household management was real work. The peasant woman's physical labour was real work, arguably the most visible work of all 3 and ironically the most dismissed. What fascinates me is this, the very thing that defined all 3 of these women. The labour they performed from before sunrise to after dark was the thing that history consistently left out. When future generations wrote about the 18th century, they wrote about kings and wars and trade routes, not about who kept the houses warm, not about who raised the children, not about who spun the thread that clothed the armies. They were the invisible architecture, the structure behind the structure. And here's what I want you to hold on to as we move forward the day I've just described. That full, exhausting, carefully managed day was happening while those same women were also navigating something else entirely. Something beneath the surface of the daily routine running like a current under still water. Their bodies. Because in the 18th century, a woman's physical experience, the reality of beauty standards, of fashion, of what she was expected to do to herself in order to be considered acceptable, was its own separate world of demands. And some of what those women did to their own bodies in the name of beauty is going to surprise you. The price of looking the part was higher than almost anything we can imagine today. And I mean that quite literally some of it could kill you. Right. So we left off with a warning. And I don't make warnings lightly. Let me ask you something before we get into this. Have you ever done something you knew wasn't great for you, kept doing it anyway, because the social cost of not doing it felt higher than the health cost of doing it? A diet that was probably too extreme, a pair of shoes that looked incredible and destroyed your feet, staying up too late too many nights in a row because rest felt like falling behind, that tension between what society expects your body to look like and what your body actually needs is not a modern invention, not even close. In the 18th century, that tension had a body count. Let's start with the skin, because the skin is where it begins. The ideal complexion in 18th century aristocratic Europe was white, not just pale white, a whiteness that suggested you had never once worked under the open sky, that you'd been indoors in candlelit rooms in silk gowns untouched by weather or labour, or the ordinary friction of a working life. Pale skin was class made visible. It was wealth written directly onto the surface of the body. To achieve it, women and men too at the higher levels of society applied a foundation made of white lead. Let me just sit with that for a moment because I want you to really hear it. White lead. The same substance that we now put warning stickers on. The same substance we removed from paint because of what it does to the human body when absorbed. That was the foundation of choice for fashionable Europeans for roughly 300 years from the Renaissance through most of the 18th century. It was called ceruse, and in its Venetian form the most prized, the most expensive variety, it was considered the finest cosmetic product available. It gave a smooth, opaque porcelain finish that no other substance could replicate. It adhered beautifully to the skin. It covered smallpox scars, which were everywhere in this era because smallpox was everywhere. It was genuinely beautiful in the short term, and it was slowly, methodically poisoning everyone who used it. The lead was absorbed through the skin. Over time, chronic exposure produced a distinctive and devastating set of symptoms. Hair loss along the frontal hairline, which the fashion conveniently disguised by pushing the hairline back. Inflammation of the eyes, erosion of the tooth enamel, blackening of the gums, skin that became progressively more damaged and discoloured, which then required more ceruse to cover, which caused more damage in a cycle that could only end one way. Long-term users reported memory loss, irritability, difficulty with coordination. We now recognise all of these as classic symptoms of lead poisoning. They recognised that something was wrong. They kept using it anyway. Do you ever wonder what that thought process looked like from the inside? I think about it often. These were intelligent, educated women. They weren't naive. They knew the paint was harsh. Some writers of the period explicitly warned against it. A 1760 beauty manual called The Art of Beauty warned readers against using cinnabar, a mercury compound, as rouge, correctly identifying the tooth decay and excessive salivation it caused. And then in the very next breath, the same manual recommended a white foundation containing lead. The knowledge was partial, the alternatives were inadequate, and the social pressure was total. The most famous victim of ceruse in the 18th century was a woman named Maria Gunning, who became Countess of Coventry upon her marriage. She and her sisters were, by most contemporary accounts, among the most celebrated beauties in London, the kind of women whose appearances in public drew crowds and required guards whose faces launched not ships but social careers. When Maria arrived in London from Ireland around 1750, she was described as having a beauty so striking that King George II assigned a guard to escort her through the streets simply because she was mobbed by admirers wherever she went. And Maria, terrified, I imagine, of losing the beauty that had brought her everything, painted her face with ceruse obsessively. Her husband reportedly tried to wipe the makeup from her face with his handkerchief. She reportedly refused. The lead ate through her skin. Her complexion, which she was frantically trying to preserve, was being destroyed by the very thing she was using to protect it. She died in 1760 at 27 years old. The newspapers of the time called it death by vanity. I find that phrase deeply unkind because what Maria was doing was responding with the tools available to her, to a world that had decided her entire value resided in her appearance. She didn't create that world. She just couldn't survive it. Now here's where I want to push back a little on the conventional history, because beauty culture in the 18th century was more complicated than just women passively suffering under impossible standards. Some of it was genuinely subversive. The beauty patch is a perfect example of this. These were small pieces of black silk or velvet, sometimes taffeta, cut into shapes. Circles, crescents, stars, hearts, little coach and horses on someone's forehead if they were feeling particularly theatrical. They were glued to the face with gum arabic or mastic resin. The French called them mouche flies because of how they looked against the white skin, small dark shapes hovering on a pale surface like insects on snow. They started practically enough as a way to cover scars and blemishes. Smallpox survivors wore them to disguise pockmarks. Women using ceruse wore them to hide the spots where the lead had damaged their skin. Practical origin story, entirely unglamorous beginning. But by the early 18th century, the beauty patch had evolved into something far more interesting, a full social and political language worn directly on the face. The placement of each patch had a meaning. Near the corner of the eye, the passionate. In the centre of the forehead, the majestic. At the corner of the mouth, the kissing. On the right cheek, married. On the left cheek, engaged. And this is the one that I love in England, which cheek you wore your patch on identified your political affiliation. Women who supported the Whig Party wore patches on the right side. Tory women wore patches on the left. One diarist of the period recorded a woman who'd accidentally worn her patch on the wrong side, and caused genuine confusion among her social circle. Think about that. In a world where women had no vote, no official political voice, no recognized role in public life, they developed a visual language worn on their actual faces to signal their political allegiances. That is not passivity. That is creativity operating under constraint. That is exactly the kind of quiet ingenuity I keep encountering when I look closely at women's history. And here's what I find most remarkable: when political tensions were high, during election seasons, during moments of factional conflict, women's faces became a kind of walking propaganda. They couldn't vote, but they could communicate, and everyone around them knew how to read the code. Let's move from the face down to the body, because we need to talk about stays, and before we do, I want to address something directly, because this is one of the areas where popular history has done the most damage. The story most people have absorbed about 18th century stays goes something like this. Women were forced into agonizing whalebone corsets that crushed their ribs, made them unable to breathe, caused them to faint regularly into fainting couches, and possibly required surgical rib removal to achieve the fashionable silhouette. Almost all of that is wrong. And the fact that it's wrong actually makes the real story more interesting. 18th century stays, the word corset wasn't commonly used until later in the century, were primarily designed not to compress the waist into extreme narrowness, but to support the bust, distribute weight across the torso, and create the conical upright silhouette that the era considered elegant. They were heavily boned with whalebone or reed, but historians who have studied surviving examples carefully have found that most 18th century stays were constructed to hold the body in a specific shape, not to dramatically reduce its size. A woman who grew up wearing them from childhood found them perfectly comfortable. They were in a very real sense functional garments. The horror stories about rib removal there is, as fashion historian Valerie Steele puts it, absolutely no evidence this ever happened. The surgical techniques of the era could not have supported such a procedure and kept the patient alive. The myth is compelling precisely because it sounds so extreme, but it belongs in the same category as dragons and haunted houses, a good story that doesn't survive historical scrutiny. The fainting couch story is similarly complicated. Yes, there were cases of women fainting. There were also cases of women fainting in hot, overcrowded ballrooms after not eating enough, because the fashion for extreme slenderness discouraged food, or simply because the human body is not infallible. The tight lacing that caused genuine health damage was largely a later development more associated with the mid to late 19th century than the 18th. In the 1700s, the more pressing garment-related problem wasn't the stays themselves, it was the sheer weight of the outer clothing. The panniers, those enormous side hoops that made skirts extend several feet to each side at the height of Rococo fashion, could make sitting in a regular chair impossible, navigating a doorway a tactical challenge, and riding in a carriage an exercise in geometric problem-solving. The Duchess of Devonshire, who we met in an earlier section of our story, became famous partly for wearing hairstyles so tall that she reportedly had to lean out of carriage windows rather than sit upright. Was this practical? Obviously not. Was it fashionable? Extremely. Was she suffering? Probably somewhat. Was she choosing it? Yes, within the limits of a social world that made opting out of fashion essentially equivalent to opting out of society entirely. Which brings me to the part of this conversation that I find most philosophically interesting. The question isn't just why did women accept these harmful standards? The more honest question is, what does it mean to accept something when the alternative is social exclusion, economic vulnerability, and the loss of the only kind of power available to you? In the 18th century, for a woman at the top of the social pyramid, her appearance was quite literally her professional tool. Her ability to enter the right rooms, attract the right allies, negotiate the right marriages for herself or for her children, all of this depended in part on how she presented. The cosmetics and the clothes were not vanity in some simple, self-absorbed sense. They were investment. In a world where you had no bank account, no legal property, no career, no vote, your face was in a very real economic sense one of your only assets. That doesn't make it right. It makes it rational. And there's a difference. What I also notice, and this is something that took me a while to understand, is that these beauty practices were not entirely devoid of genuine pleasure. The dressing table ritual I described earlier, those long hours of the toilette, wasn't just suffering. Women wrote about the pleasure of it, the intimacy of it, the shared time with maids and friends and sisters who gathered in the dressing room, the sense of transformation of crafting a self layer by layer for the day ahead. There's a reason human beings have decorated themselves since the beginning of recorded history and probably long before. The desire to make something of your appearance to signal who you are or who you want to be or what you feel today, that's not trivial. The 18th century took it to dangerous extremes, but the underlying impulse was human and recognizable, and in some ways quite beautiful. The tragedy was not that women wanted to be beautiful. The tragedy was that the standards of beauty they were handed required them to damage themselves to achieve it. The tragedy was a system that offered women so few other forms of power that the management of their own appearance became for some a life's work. Here's something I want you to hold on to because it connects to everything we've been talking about and everything we're going to discuss. The same age of enlightenment that produced philosophy about reason, liberty, and the dignity of the individual, that same era produced lead-based cosmetics, whale-boned stays, and a society where a woman's entire social value could be held together with gum arabic and white powder. The Enlightenment was in many ways a celebration of the male mind. The female body was still very much a project to be shaped, contained, displayed and controlled, and the beauty industry, if we can call it that, was one of the most effective tools of that control, all the more powerful, because many women internalized it as desire rather than compulsion. The farther we get into this story, the more clearly I see that the constraints on women in the 18th century weren't only legal or political. They were somatic, they operated on the body itself, and understanding that changes how you read everything else. Speaking of which, the body in the 18th century wasn't just a surface to be decorated. It was also a site of something far more intimate, far more dangerous, and far more revelatory about the era than any corset or beauty patch could ever be. We're talking about what happened in the private spaces of marriage desire, and a woman's inner life, the territory that the law did not touch, that manners did not discuss, and that women navigated almost entirely on their own. It is the part of the story that history has been the most reluctant to tell, honestly, and it's coming up next. There is a particular kind of silence in history, and once you learn to recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere. It's the silence that appears when something was too complicated, too uncomfortable, or too politically inconvenient to write down honestly. And nowhere in the story of 18th century women is that silence more deliberate, more carefully maintained than in everything surrounding their private desires, their intimate lives, and the impossible double standard they were expected to navigate without complaint. So let's go there, carefully, honestly, and with the respect it deserves. Here is a legal reality that most people don't know, and that I think deserves to be stated plainly. In 18th century England, the law recognised rape as a serious crime. There were trials, convictions, and in some cases executions. The legal framework existed, but it contained one enormous officially codified gap: a husband could not legally rape his wife. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate doctrine articulated most clearly by the jurist Matthew Hale in the 1730s, who wrote that a wife by her act of marriage had given her irrevocable consent to her husband for the duration of the marriage. Irrevocable, meaning she could not take it back. Meaning from the day of the wedding, legally speaking, she had consented to everything in advance forever. I want to be precise about what this meant in practice, because precision matters here. It did not mean that every marriage was violent or coercive. Many marriages, as we'll see, were genuinely loving and mutually satisfying. But it did mean that a woman who was harmed within her marriage had almost no legal recourse whatsoever. The law offered her nothing. The church told her to endure. Society told her to be grateful. And here is the part that I think gets overlooked in even sympathetic tellings of this history. Some men in the 18th century actually pushed back against this doctrine. The writer Daniel Defoe, the same Defoe who wrote Robinson Crusoe, published a work in the 1720s, arguing explicitly that marriage did not grant a husband unlimited sexual authority over his wife. He wrote, and I'll paraphrase carefully, that a woman may be wronged within the marriage bed, and that a man who does so deserves the harshest punishment. He called it in plain English a crime. That was a radical thing to write. It was barely noticed. His treatise was never reprinted in his lifetime. The marital rape exemption in English law was not abolished until 1991. I want you to sit with that timeline. Defoe was arguing against it in the 1720s. The law caught up 270 years later. That is not an abstraction. That is a very long time. Now, having said all of that, and I mean all of it, I want to offer a more complete picture. Because the history of women's intimate lives in the 18th century is not only a story of coercion. If you read it that way exclusively, you miss something important. There is also evidence, fragmentary, mostly indirect, sometimes surprisingly frank, of women's genuine desire, real pleasure and active pursuit of the kind of intimacy they wanted. Court records from this period, particularly in Scotland, include testimony from women who were so sexually aggressive toward the men they wanted that the men felt the need to mention it in legal proceedings. One woman, recorded in a 1719 trial, reportedly took a man's hand and placed it on her body and told him she could offer no clearer proof of her love. Another woman, in what must have been a memorable deposition, broke into a house where a man was sleeping, climbed into bed, and left no ambiguity whatsoever about her intentions. These women were not operating from passivity. They were operating from desire. Married couples, in their letters and diaries when they wrote about the bedroom at all, which was usually in a kind of affectionate code, alluded to genuine pleasure on both sides. The diarist James Boswell, whose private journals are among the most unfiltered personal documents of the century, recorded his wife using physical distance, staying out of their shared bed, as a deliberate response to his infidelities, which tells you that the bed was recognized by both of them as a space where her feelings mattered. She had power there, even if it was the power of withdrawal. What the 18th century was absolutely not was sexually repressed in the Victorian sense that came later. The Victorians, with their elaborate architecture of prudery, were in many ways reacting against the relative sexual frankness of the century that preceded them. The 18th century had a ribald popular press, a flourishing pornographic literature, a theatrical culture that celebrated female wit and desire openly, and a public discourse about love, pleasure, and the body that was considerably less squeamish than what followed it. So the picture is complicated. It always is. Women were constrained and desire was real. Both things are true simultaneously, which brings us to one of the most fascinating and disturbing social structures of the era, the double standard. If a married man of means had a mistress or several, this was understood, accepted, and in many circles even expected. It was not discussed at dinner in polite company, but neither was it hidden. It was simply a feature of the landscape like weather. The wives knew, the household staff knew. Sometimes the mistress was received socially in spaces adjacent to the wife, as in the extraordinary case we discussed earlier of Georgiana and Lady Elizabeth Foster sharing a home and a husband for over 2 decades. But if a married woman took a lover, if she exercised the same freedom her husband claimed as a matter of course, the consequences were catastrophic and one-directional. She was ruined. That word meant something specific and total in the 18th century. Ruined meant socially destroyed. It meant potentially losing custody of her children, because under the law her children belonged to her husband. It meant losing the financial security of her marriage. It meant being shut out of the drawing rooms, the assemblies, the networks of friendship and influence that constituted a woman's entire social world. It meant in the most extreme cases a kind of public execution by gossip and exclusion from which there was no recovery. The legal mechanism for this was a lawsuit called criminal conversation, a wonderfully euphemistic name for an adultery proceeding in which an injured husband sued his wife's lover for damages, not his wife, her lover, because his wife was his property and her infidelity was a violation of his property rights. She was the object of the lawsuit, not a participant in it. She had no standing. The court case was about the man's honour. Her voice was not required. A woman's reputation, in other words, was a fragile and precious thing that she could lose in a single afternoon and never recover. A man's reputation was essentially indestructible by the same acts. Does that remind you of anything? I'll leave that question where it lands. And yet, and I cannot stop marvelling at this, some women found ways to live outside the rules anyway. Not all of them, and not without cost, but some of them. I want to tell you about Kitty Fisher. Catherine Maria Fisher was born in London sometime around 1740 into modest circumstances, a milliner's daughter, by some accounts the daughter of a tradesman by others. The details of her early life are hazy, which was common enough for women of her class who hadn't yet done anything the newspapers considered worth recording. And then, around 1758, she did something that made every newspaper in London pay attention. She became a celebrated courtesan, and she decided with extraordinary deliberateness to manage her own story. The watershed moment came in 1759 when her horse threw her in St. James's Park. She landed on the ground in front of a crowd. The satirists and broadsheet writers immediately went to work on the obvious pun, a fallen woman falling. They expected her to retreat to hide, to be ashamed. She did the opposite. She went directly to Sir Joshua Reynolds, the most celebrated portrait painter in England, and had her portrait made. The print was sold commercially. Thousands of Londoners bought it. Kitty Fisher did not just survive the scandal, she weaponized it. Over the next several years, Kitty Fisher became something genuinely new, the first celebrity in the modern sense of that word. Her image was everywhere. Her name was in every newspaper. The Kitty Fisher bonnet was the must-have fashion accessory of 1759 and 1760. Reynolds painted her multiple times once as Cleopatra, dissolving a pearl in wine, which said everything about how she saw herself and how she wanted to be seen. When Casanova visited London and encountered her, he wrote about her diamonds being worth a fortune. She reportedly once ate £100 banknote sandwiched between 2 slices of buttered bread, Whether this is literally true or a wonderful legend, it perfectly captures the spirit of someone who understood that her power came from being talked about, and who refused to be talked about on anyone else's terms. Kitty Fisher spent £12,000 a year, a staggering sum. She was a businesswoman in the only industry available to a woman of her birth and looks in that era. And she knew it, and she ran it accordingly. The fascinating coda to her story is this: she retired from her life as a courtesan and married a member of Parliament in 1766. Within her marriage, by all accounts, she was a devoted and capable wife who helped rebuild her husband's family fortune and was remembered with genuine affection by the people of the local community. She died in 1767, just 4 months after her wedding. She was 25 years old. I've thought about Kitty Fisher a lot. She was not a feminist in any sense we'd recognise. She didn't write manifestos or argue for women's rights. She operated entirely within the system. But she understood the system with a clarity and a precision that most people, men or women, never achieved. She knew that in a world that commodified female attractiveness, the most subversive thing she could do was commodify it on her own terms, at her own price, on her own schedule. She refused to be a victim of the same system she was participating in. Was she free? No. Were any women of her era free in any meaningful sense? Also no. But Kitty Fisher was knowing. She was a woman who saw clearly, acted deliberately, and left a mark on history that was supposed to be invisible, because women like her weren't supposed to be remembered at all. What I keep returning to in thinking about all of this, the legal frameworks, the double standards, the extraordinary resilience of individual women navigating impossible situations, is the question of what we mean when we talk about a woman's private life. In the 18th century, there was almost no such thing. A woman's body belonged legally to her husband. Her intimate choices were policed by family, church, and neighbourhood. Her reputation was a public asset she held in trust for the men associated with her. The very concept of genuine privacy, of a space where she was accountable only to herself, barely existed. And yet women made spaces. In the margins of letters they weren't supposed to write. In the coded language of friendship. In the choices, however constrained, however costly, that they made anyway. The inner life, it turns out, is remarkably difficult to legislate. We've spent a long time in the private and domestic world of 18th century women. We've been inside their bedrooms and their dressing rooms and their marriages. But there's another world waiting for us, one that is in many ways the most surprising of all. Because the story of women in this century is not only a story of constraint, it is also a story of women who worked, not just in the hidden labour of household management that we've already touched on, but women who built businesses, ran accounts, negotiated contracts, and powered entire industries without anyone thinking to write their names down. The economic life of 18th century women is one of the most underestimated stories in all of European history, and it is coming up right now. You know what bothers me about the way history gets taught, really gets under my skin, is how thoroughly it has managed to erase an entire economic reality that was sitting right there in plain sight. Here is what almost every history textbook will tell you about women in the 18th century. They didn't work. They stayed home. They managed the household, raised the children, and waited for their husbands to come home with the money. The world of commerce was a man's world, and women inhabited a separate domestic sphere entirely. Here is what the actual historical record shows: that version is almost entirely wrong. And not just a little wrong. Spectacularly, comprehensively wrong in a way that once you see it, clearly makes you wonder how it persisted so long. Let's start with some numbers, because numbers have a way of cutting through comfortable mythology. At the beginning of the 18th century, the export trade in woolen goods accounted for more than a quarter of all British exports. A significant portion of this, the spinning, the carding, the preparation of fibres, was done by women working in their homes under what was called the putting out system. Merchants supplied raw wool or flax. Women processed it. Merchants collected it and sold the finished cloth. The women got paid by the piece. And here's the detail that matters every single weaver. And weaving was predominantly male, required between 4 and 10 spinners to keep him supplied with yarn. 4 to 10. Which means for every man at the loom there were at minimum 4 women spinning in their homes, without whom the loom would have been silent. The entire textile industry, which powered a substantial portion of the British and European economy, throughout this century depended on a female workforce that the official historical narrative spent 200 years not particularly caring about. The wool trade doubled between 1701 and 1770. The cotton export trade grew tenfold in the same period. Behind those numbers, millions of women's hands. None of their names are in the economic histories. Now here's what I find genuinely interesting about this labour beyond the simple injustice of its invisibility. It wasn't just economically significant, it gave women something that the official social story said they didn't have. It gave them income. An income even in small amounts, even in a world where most of it went directly into the family pot, meant some degree of independent economic existence. Historians studying household budgets from this period have found something that challenged a lot of earlier assumptions in many working families. The wife's contribution to household income was not marginal or supplementary. It was substantial. Sometimes it was comparable to, or in certain regions exceeded, the husband's earnings from agricultural labour. The academic term historians now use is the two-supporter model, meaning that for most working households in 18th century Europe, the economic reality was not one breadwinner but 2. It just happened that only one of them was acknowledged as such. Think about what that means. An entire class of women was producing economic value, contributing to family survival, participating in markets, and being described in legal and social terms as entirely dependent and domestically confined. The gap between what women actually did and what the cultural story said women did was enormous. And we've been slowly closing that gap in historical scholarship really only since the 1970s. But spinning and weaving are only the beginning. Let me take you somewhere more specific, more vivid. In 18th century Paris, the central market, Les Halles, was a world unto itself. Thousands of women worked there every day as vendors, fishwives, fruit sellers, flower sellers, herb merchants, butter dealers. The French called them les poissardes, the fishwives, as a kind of catch-all term, though their actual range of trade was far wider than fish. These women were not marginal figures. They were in a very real sense the food infrastructure of Paris. They were the ones who got up before dawn to receive the supply carts from the countryside. They were the ones who set the prices that ordinary Parisians paid for their daily bread and produce. They were the ones who knew, sometimes before anyone else did, when supplies were short, when harvest had failed, when the city's food security was under threat. A contemporary observer of Parisian life named Louis-Sébastien Mercier, writing in the 1780s, captured the essence of their power in 5 blunt words: Les poissardes font la loi. The fishwives make the rules. He wasn't being satirical, he was being accurate. These market women had developed over generations an extraordinary network of information. They knew the political situation, they knew the price of bread, they knew who was in favour at court and who had fallen. They led spontaneous revolts against police when bailiffs tried to arrest debtors in their quarter. They protected vulnerable members of their community with physical force when necessary. And they had a ceremonial role at Versailles itself. By ancient tradition. They were present at royal births, verifying that the new heir was indeed a legitimate child of the crown. Les Poissardes had a formal relationship with the monarchy that stretched back centuries. And then came October of 1789. The harvest of 1788 had been disastrous. Bread prices reached the highest point in the entire century. By the summer of 1789, a working family in Paris was spending up to 90% of its income on bread alone. The women of the markets who felt this in their bones every single day, who watched their customers' faces grow thinner, who knew exactly how bad the situation was, had reached a breaking point. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, approximately 6,000 to 7,000 people, mostly women led by the market, women of Les Halles gathered armed themselves with whatever was available: pikes, muskets, axes, and at least one small cannon that they apparently stole from the city hall, because why not, and began a 12-mile march through the rain to the Palace of Versailles. Their stated goal was simple: to demand that the king release grain supplies to feed the city. What actually happened was that they forced the royal family out of Versailles and back to Paris, where the king could be watched and controlled. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette left Versailles on October 6th. They would never see it again. The French monarchy did not end that day, but the chain of events that would end it less than 4 years later began on those rain-soaked 12 miles, and it was begun by the fishwives. I want you to really sit with that. The women who are supposed to be economically dependent, politically silent, domestically confined, those women operating from their position in the marketplace, with their knowledge of food prices and their networks of communication, and their complete lack of interest in being told what to do, those women are the ones who dragged a king out of his palace. History calls it the Women's March on Versailles. In a lot of textbooks it gets a paragraph. Sometimes not even that. Now let me bring it back to ground level, because not every working woman of the 18th century marched on a palace. Most of them were doing something considerably less dramatic, but no less economically meaningful. In London, which by 1700 had become the largest city in Europe, women were woven into the commercial fabric in ways that are still being recovered by historians. Studies of guild records, trade directories, insurance policies, and newspaper advertisements have identified women operating in nearly 100 different trades in the city. At least 165 women registered their own marks as silversmiths over the course of the century. More than 250 women worked in the printing industry. 500 or more traded as millinery proprietors, which in this era was not just hat selling, but a substantial retail and manufacturing operation. These numbers, by the way, represent only the women who traded in their own names. Because of the doctrine of coverture, that legal erasure of the married woman's identity, any woman who worked alongside a husband and died before him essentially vanished from the record entirely. Her contribution was absorbed into his name and his legacy, so every figure we have understates the reality. What the guild records also show is that girls were formerly apprenticed to guild mistresses in significant numbers. In Paris, between 1746 and 1759, the Seamstresses Guild recorded an average of 419 new apprentices every year. Most contracts ran 3 years, which meant at any given moment there were more than 1,000 apprentices learning their trade in Parisian workshops under female supervision. Seamstresses were the largest single apprenticeship group in the city, male or female. The most common trade training happening in 18th century Paris was women training other women to make a living. That image has been almost completely absent from our popular understanding of this era. And then there were the businesswomen who operated on a larger scale, the ones who ran enterprises significant enough to leave insurance records and legal documentation. Historians examining the Sun Life insurance records for London in this period have found women who owned substantial stock, real property and working capital. Women who had established lines of credit that survived marriage, widowhood and remarriage. Women who were in every practical sense entrepreneurs, running operations, managing employees, negotiating with suppliers. The best loophole in the coverture system, it turned out, was widowhood. When a husband died, the legal restrictions on a wife's economic independence died with him. A widow could own property. She could make contracts. She could sue and be sued. She could, in short, do all the things that a normal adult human being needs to do in order to participate in economic life, and a surprising number of women seize this moment with both hands. The historical pattern is remarkably consistent. A woman would spend years, sometimes decades, working alongside her husband in a business, learning every aspect of the operation, managing the accounts, dealing with suppliers and customers, while her husband held the formal legal identity of the enterprise. Then her husband died, and suddenly, with the legal fiction of coverture removed, the same woman who had been running the business all along was now officially running the business. And in many cases she ran it better. The Champagne house Veuve Clicquot is perhaps the most famous example, though Barbe Nicole Clicquot was slightly after our century in the early 1800s. But the pattern was already well established by the 1700s. Widows who inherited businesses frequently expanded them, improved them, and left them larger and more profitable than they have found them. Here is the thing that I keep turning over in my mind, and I'll share it with you because I think it matters. The economic contribution of women in the 18th century was not invisible because it was small. It was invisible because the dominant cultural narrative had decided in advance that women didn't work and then simply refused to see the evidence that contradicted this. This is what historians call presentism, in reverse projecting an ideal onto the past rather than seeing what was actually there. The Victorian ideal of the woman who stayed home while the man went out to work was read backwards onto a society where that was never for most families the actual reality. And the erasure was so thorough, so complete, that it took historians a very long time to undo it. When you look at what women actually did in the 18th century at the market, women of Paris and the lace makers of Bruges and the milliners of London and the spinners of Yorkshire, the guild mistresses and the widowed businesswomen and the cottage workers whose thread built an empire, you see an economic landscape that looks almost nothing like the one we've been taught. You see women who are indispensable. Women who, when their economic position was threatened, when bread prices rose beyond bearing, when the harvest failed, when the system stopped working, were willing to pick up a pike and march 12 miles in the rain to make their displeasure known. That kind of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from knowing, even when the law and the culture refuse to say so, that you are the one holding things together. That without you the looms fall silent and the markets go dark and the palaces run out of bread. The women who worked in the 18th century knew their own worth even when no one else did. And that knowledge, that quiet, stubborn, unrecorded certainty, is going to become something much more interesting and much more explosive when it moves from the marketplace into the mind. Because while the fishwives of Paris were maintaining the food supply, something else was happening in the drawing rooms and coffee houses of Europe. Women were beginning to think, to argue, to write, to organize, to imagine for the first time in a very long time what a world might look like that made room for their intelligence rather than their labor alone. The great intellectual revolution of the 18th century, the movement we call the Enlightenment, was supposedly about reason, liberty, and the dignity of the human being. But it took a specific group of women to point out publicly, and at considerable personal cost, that the Enlightenment had quietly excluded half of humanity from its promise. Those women are coming up next, and their story is one of the most fascinating and most infuriating in all of European history. Somewhere in Paris in the year 1755, a woman named Marie-Thérèse Rodet-Geoffrin is setting the table. Not a metaphor. She is literally setting a table, overseeing the food, the arrangement of chairs, the placement of candles, the seating order that would ensure the right people ended up in conversation with each other. Twice a week, every week, her apartment on the Rue Saint-Honoré would fill with some of the most extraordinary minds in Europe, Philosophers, scientists, writers, diplomats, artists. Men who are rewriting the way human beings understood themselves and their world. And at the centre of all of it, this woman who had received almost no formal education whatsoever, who had taught herself to read as an adult by visiting the salon of her neighbour, Madame de Tencin, who had no university degree, no professional title, no official position of any kind, and who was by any honest assessment the most important intellectual organiser of the French Enlightenment. Let me say that again, because I think it deserves to land. The most important intellectual organiser of the French Enlightenment was a self-educated woman who had figured out how to build a university out of a dining room. Here is the central paradox of educated women in the 18th century, and I've been thinking about how to frame this in a way that captures how genuinely strange it is. The Enlightenment, this great philosophical revolution that swept through Europe beginning in the early 1700s, was built on the idea that reason is the highest human faculty. That any person who could think clearly, argue well, and engage with evidence deserved to be heard. The Enlightenment philosophers wrote rhapsodically about the dignity of the individual mind. They attacked systems of inherited privilege, the idea that birth determined worth, as irrational and unjust. And then, with a very few exceptions, they turned around and said, but not women. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, perhaps the most influential social thinker of the entire century, wrote extensively about the ideal education for a young man, how he should be given freedom to explore, to reason, to discover through experience. And then he wrote about the ideal education for a young woman, which he called Sophie, the fictional female companion to his ideal male. Sophie should learn to please. She should learn to be agreeable. She should learn to conceal her intellect and defer to her husband in all things. The purpose of educating a woman, Rousseau believed, was to make her a better ornament and helpmate for a man. This was not a fringe view. This was mainstream Enlightenment thinking. Now, to be fair to the complexity of the era, and I think historical honesty requires fairness, there were male Enlightenment thinkers who genuinely believed in women's intellectual equality. The philosopher and mathematician Nicolas de Condorcet wrote an explicit argument in 1790 that women should have the vote and full civic equality. He lost the argument and his ideas were largely ignored until much later, but he made them. He was not alone. The Enlightenment was not monolithic, and the debate about women's education and rights was a real and active debate within it. But the dominant view, the practical outcome of the century, was that women's minds were supplementary at best and dangerous at worst. Too much education would make a woman unfeminine. It might make her unsuitable for marriage. It might give her ideas above her station. The fear was real and widespread, and it was dressed up in the language of science and nature to give it an authority it hadn't earned. And yet, into this headwind, extraordinary things happened. This salon was the solution that women of intelligence and resources invented for themselves. And I want to give you a real sense of what these institutions were not, the romanticized version, but the actual operating socially and intellectually powerful thing that they were. Madame Geoffrin's salon ran for approximately 30 years, from the 1740s through the 1770s. She held 2 dinners a week in her apartment, Mondays for artists, Wednesdays for writers and philosophers. Among her regular guests, Diderot, d'Alembert, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Fontenelle, the encyclopédiste, who were producing the most ambitious intellectual project of the century. She didn't just feed them, she managed them. She mediated disputes. She provided funding. She paid for the translation and publication of the French edition of the Encyclopédie, one of the defining documents of the Enlightenment, at her own expense. When artists needed patronage, she directed wealthy visitors toward their work. When philosophers needed access to government officials, she arranged the introductions. And she did all of this with a rule that now seems almost comically specific, but was in practice crucial to the salon's success: no religion, no politics as topics of discussion. This wasn't cowardice, it was tactical brilliance. By keeping the conversation in the realm of ideas rather than faction, she could maintain a space where people of different allegiances could actually talk to each other. The salon survived because it had a skilled enough operator at the centre to keep it functioning. Historians who have studied the death of the salon as an institution in France have noted something striking when Madame Geoffrin died in 1777, and when Julie de Lespinasse died the year before her. The philosophical salon network in Paris essentially collapsed. The men who had depended on these spaces found that without the women who had organised them, they couldn't replicate the conditions that made them work. The salons were not accessories to the Enlightenment. They were, as one historian has bluntly put it, part of its very infrastructure. Now let me tell you about a specific detail that I find absolutely fascinating, and that I think changes the way you understand what power actually looked like for women in this era. Between the years 1767 and 1776, 8 philosophers were elected to the French Academy, the most prestigious intellectual institution in the country. The French Academy determined who was recognized as a legitimate voice in French intellectual life. Membership meant influence, patronage, and access to the networks of power. All 8 of those philosophers were regular attendees of Julie de Lespinasse's salon, where her close companion d'Alembert had been quietly cultivating their candidacies. Julie herself was not a member of the Academy. Women were categorically excluded. She could never be elected to the institution whose composition she was effectively shaping. Think about that architecture for a moment. The formal institution that recognized intellectual achievement barred women from membership. But the informal institution, the salon, was where the decisions about that formal institution were actually being made by women. It's one of the clearest examples I know of in all of history of how real power and official power can occupy completely different spaces. In England, something parallel but distinctly different was happening, and the English version of the intellectual women's movement has a much funnier origin story. In the 1750s, a group of London women began organising what they called conversations gatherings in their homes that deliberately substituted intellectual discussion for the card games that had become the default activity of genteel social evenings. One of the founding figures was Elizabeth Montagu, who was by all accounts formidably brilliant, extensively self-educated, and completely comfortable in the company of the leading minds of her time. At one of her early gatherings, she invited a botanist named Benjamin Stillingfleet, who declined on the grounds that he lacked appropriate evening dress, specifically the white silk stockings that propriety required. She told him to come in his ordinary blue worsted stockings anyway. He did, and the gatherings became known as the Blue Stocking Society, or as the French later translated it, Bas Bleu, and the women who ran them became the Blue Stockings, one of the most important intellectual networks in 18th century Britain. I love this story because it captures something true about how women's intellectual spaces came into being, often accidentally, often through the improvisation of a specific moment, always in the margins of what official society was prepared to acknowledge. The Blue Stockings were not all of the same opinion. They included conservatives and reformers, women who were deeply skeptical of the French salon model, and women who admired it, women who wanted to expand the definition of female intellectual life, and women who were uncomfortable with anything that smelled of radicalism. Elizabeth Carter, one of the founding members, translated the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus from Greek, a genuinely formidable scholarly achievement. Hannah More, another core member, became one of the most widely read writers in England. Fanny Burney, who was associated with the Circle, wrote novels that were read by everyone from the king to the street sweepers. And yet, and this is something that gets discussed too rarely, Many of the Bluestockings themselves were deeply ambivalent about Mary Wollstonecraft when she came along, because Mary Wollstonecraft was going somewhere they weren't ready to follow. Let me tell you about Wollstonecraft because her story deserves more than the footnote it usually gets. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in 1759 to a family in which the father was violent and incompetent, and the mother chronically unwell. She was largely self-educated. She worked as a governess, a teacher, a seamstress, a paid companion, all the jobs that society made available to educated women who needed to earn a living. None of them paid adequately. None of them offered any kind of security. And through all of this she read, constantly voraciously in whatever time she could carve from the margins of working days. She read the Enlightenment philosophers. She read Rousseau. And the more she read Rousseau, the more furious she became. In 1792 she published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In it she made an argument that was breathtaking in its directness, that women were not naturally inferior to men, that they only appeared inferior because they had been systematically denied education, and that this denial was not only unjust to women, but destructive to society as a whole. She called Rousseau's educational ideal for women that whole, Sophie framework, a system designed to produce beautiful, charming, helpless creatures who were useless to anyone, including themselves. She called marriage, in one of her most incendiary phrases, a form of legal prostitution, because it forced women into a transaction where their only asset was their bodies, and their only security came through a man's choice to keep them. She was 33 years old when she wrote it. The book was received reasonably well. Initially it went into a second edition immediately in 1792, and several American editions appeared, and it was translated into French. The people who dismissed it or mocked it were mostly those who were already ideologically committed to dismissing it. A satirist wrote a parody called A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, arguing that if women could have rights, why not animals, which is almost endearingly bad faith as a rebuttal. But here is the cruel twist in Wollstonecraft's story. After her death in 1797, 11 days after giving birth to her second daughter, the future Mary Shelley, her husband William Godwin, published a memoir of her life that disclosed everything: the illegitimate daughter, the two ill-fated affairs, the attempted suicides. He meant it as a tribute. It was interpreted as ammunition. Within a decade her name had become synonymous with immorality, and the work that might have changed the century was quietly set aside. It would not be picked up again in any serious way for nearly 100 years. Susan Anthony, one of the leaders of the American women's suffrage movement, inscribed her name on her personal copy of The Vindication in the 1870s. I think about this often. The gap between what Wollstonecraft argued and when the world was ready to hear it is roughly 80 years. And in those 80 years, a great deal of what she described, the educational inequality, the legal dependence, the beauty and marriage trap, continued exactly as she had named it. There's a question here that I keep sitting with, and I'll share it with you. Why does it take so long for ideas that are obviously correct to become acceptable? I don't think it's because people are stupid. I think it's because the ideas that threaten existing arrangements of power always face resistance in proportion to how much they threaten. And Wollstonecraft wasn't just suggesting that women should read more books. She was suggesting that the entire structure of marriage, education, and social life needed to be reconceived. That's not a small ask. But here's what I find genuinely hopeful in all of this: the ideas didn't disappear. They went underground into letters, into novels, into the quiet conversations of women who had read Wollstonecraft's work and filed it away. Seeds that would germinate later in conditions that hadn't yet arrived. The women of the 18th century who thought and argued and wrote and organized were operating in a world that was not willing to take them seriously. But they created the framework, the intellectual architecture that would eventually be used to dismantle the very system they had been born into. That's not a small thing, that's actually an enormous thing. And as we move forward in this story, you're going to see something that I find both beautiful and infuriating, how the most ordinary aspects of daily life, not the grand salons, not the philosophical treatises, but the rhythms of faith, the practices of prayer, the structure of the church calendar shaped women's inner lives in ways that the grand narrative of the Enlightenment largely pretended weren't happening. Because while Paris was debating the rights of reason, the women of Europe were living inside a different kind of structure entirely. One that was older than the Enlightenment, more intimate than any salon, and in some ways more powerful than either. Religion was not just a Sunday obligation for these women. It was the air they breathed, and its relationship to their freedom was far more complicated than either its defenders or its critics were prepared to admit. Pull back from the salons for a moment. Pull back from the pamphlet wars and the philosophical debates. Back away from Paris entirely. Because for most women in 18th century Europe, the most immediate and most intimate relationship they had with any kind of structure larger than their family was not with the Enlightenment. It was with the church. Not the church as an institution, though that matters, and we'll get to it. I mean the church as a daily embodied practice. The sound of bells marking the hours. The rhythm of the church calendar moving through the year. The weekly ritual of dressing for services. The private conversation of prayer in a darkened room. The confessional, at least for Catholic women, as the one place in their entire social world where they were invited to speak honestly in complete privacy, with the promise that what they said would be held in confidence. That last one strikes me as worth sitting with. In a world where women had almost no legal privacy, no professional privacy, no financial privacy, the confessional was a space that was technically and theologically entirely their own. What a woman told her confessor her husband could not know. Her father could not know. Her priest was bound under pain of excommunication to absolute silence. For some women, it was the only conversation in their lives that no one else could hear. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Let me be honest about the complexity here, because I think collapsing this into a simple narrative does a disservice to the real history. On one side of the ledger, religion in the 18th century was often a tool of female subordination. The theological arguments for women's obedience to husbands, to fathers, to male clergy were drawn directly from Scripture and enforced with genuine conviction. St. Paul's letters, particularly the injunctions against women speaking in churches or teaching men, were quoted constantly. Women was told that their subordination was divinely ordained, natural, and spiritually virtuous, that suffering their circumstances with patience and grace was in fact a form of holiness. That is a system that benefits the people with power. It's worth naming clearly. But on the other side of the ledger, and this is the part that gets left out of the simple story, religion also gave women something that almost nothing else in their world provided: a direct, unmediated relationship with a force larger than the men who controlled their lives. You could pray to God without your husband's permission. You could have a spiritual life that no human authority could fully reach into. The interior relationship between a woman and her faith was in a way that the law explicitly was not genuinely her own. And some women used this space with extraordinary creativity. The convents are where this becomes most vivid. And I want to be specific about what I mean, because the popular image of the convent-cloistered, silent, passive women in habits is only partially true and mostly missing the interesting part. During the 17th century alone, over 80,000 women lived and were educated in convents across Catholic Europe. That is not a small number, and what they were doing inside those walls was in many cases considerably more interesting than the outside world gave them credit for. Because the convent was also a library, and a school, and a hospital, and a scriptorium, and occasionally, for the right abbess in the right institution, a centre of genuine intellectual and practical power, that rivaled anything available to women in secular life. Those who took the veil had access to the convent's library books that were unavailable to women who stayed in the world. Some nuns furthered their education in theology, medicine, music, Latin, and languages in ways that would have been practically impossible for their secular counterparts. The abbess of a large institution managed lands, governed a community of women, oversaw finances, administered care for the sick, and ran schools that educated girls from noble families across the region. Here is a specific example that I find remarkable. Christina Dennett, who became prioress of the Holy Sepulchre in Liège in the later part of the 18th century, expanded the convent school with a specific and stated goal to provide Catholic girls with, in her own words, the same advantages they would have had in the great schools of England. The school's registers from 1770 to 1794 record 350 pupils from 6 different nationalities, studying a wide range of subjects. That is a woman running an international educational institution in 1770 out of a convent in what is now Belgium. History has generally not found this particularly interesting. I find it riveting. The Protestant world offers a different and equally complicated story. When the Reformation swept through Northern Europe in the 16th century, it closed the convents in Protestant territories. At first glance, this might seem like liberation, women freed from institutional enclosure. In practice, it eliminated one of the few alternatives to marriage that had existed for women. If you were a Catholic woman, and you had no desire to marry or no suitable match was available, or you simply wanted a life oriented around learning and service rather than domesticity, the convent was your option. The Reformation took that option away. Instead, the Protestant ideal centered on the pastor's wife as a new kind of female role, educated, devout, a partner in ministry, rather than a separate religious vocation. This had some genuine advantages. Many pastors' wives became active in their communities in ways that went beyond the purely domestic. But it also meant that a woman's religious vocation was now more completely than before attached to a man's. She was a pastor's wife, not herself but herself, in relation to him. And yet, out of this same Protestant tradition in the 18th century came one of the most extraordinary and underappreciated women's movements in all of European religious history. John Wesley founded what became the Methodist movement in England in the 1740s, and by accident or intention, probably both, he created a space where women could exercise religious leadership that simply did not exist anywhere else in Britain. The early Methodist societies organized themselves into class meetings, small groups of about 12 people, who met weekly to speak honestly about their spiritual lives, encourage each other, and hold each other accountable. Women led these meetings. Women visited the sick. Women organized the logistical and pastoral fabric of the movement. And then something remarkable happened. A woman named Sarah Crosby in 1761 found herself faced with a crowd of about 200 people who had assembled to hear a Methodist meeting, and no preacher had arrived. She did what any competent leader in that situation might do. She stepped up and addressed the crowd herself. She immediately wrote to John Wesley, a little anxious, asking if she'd done wrong. Wesley wrote back and told her essentially that if she'd been called, she should answer the call. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but clearly. Sarah Crosby continued to travel and preach throughout England for the rest of her life. She was not alone. Another woman, Mary Bossonquet, who had used her own financial resources to establish a refuge for the destitute in London, wrote Wesley a careful theological letter in 1771 arguing from Scripture against the common interpretation that women must be silent in church. Her argument was that an extraordinary call from God superseded any general rule. Wesley accepted the argument. Formally in 1771, he began to allow women to preach in Methodism. For a moment, just a moment, consider how extraordinary this is. John Wesley, an 18th-century Church of England minister, in one of the most patriarchal societies in Europe, gave women explicit permission to preach the gospel publicly. Not because it was socially acceptable, it was not. Not because it was politically easy, it was not. But because he had been given an argument he found theologically sound, and he followed it. The Methodist women preachers travelled. They addressed crowds. They preached in fields and halls and private houses and wherever people would gather. Ann Cutler, Hester, Anne Rowe Rogers, Grace Murray. These women became known throughout their regions for a spiritual intensity that drew people regardless of the social oddity of a woman in a pulpit. And then Wesley died in 1791. And within 12 years the Methodist Conference had declared female preaching unnecessary and generally undesired, and ordered women preachers to restrict themselves to audiences of their own sex. 12 years. That's how long the window stayed open. Do you notice the pattern? Because I keep noticing it throughout this entire story. A moment opens, women move into it competently, sometimes brilliantly, and then the moment closes. The rules are rewritten, the window shuts. This is not a conspiracy. It's something more structural and more frustrating, a recurring dynamic in which male-led institutions are willing to use women's capacities in moments of need or expansion, and then draw back when those capacities start to look like claims on power. Wesley needed women's organizational and pastoral gifts to build the Methodist movement, so he made room. After his death, when the movement became an institution with property and hierarchy and professional stakes, the institution reverted to type. The fishwives of Paris were needed to supply the city's food, so their market presence was tolerated, and their political authority was acknowledged right up to the moment it threatened the formal political order, at which point the revolutionary government quietly pushed them aside. The convent gave women education and leadership, but only within walls, only in a space that was technically outside the secular world, only insofar as it didn't interfere with the male clergy's authority in the broader church. These stories are all different, but they rhyme. I want to end this section with something personal. Not a historical argument, but a genuine question that has stayed with me throughout all of this research. For these women, the ones who found in their faith a comfort and a companion that the secular world refused to be for them, was the religion a cage or a shelter? And I've come to think that this might be the wrong question, because sometimes the same structure can be both depending on who you are, what you need, and what moment in your life you happen to be standing in. For the woman who entered a convent voluntarily, who found there the education and the intellectual freedom and the female community that the secular world had denied her, the walls were a shelter. For the woman who was placed in a convent by a family who had no other use for her, who spent her life inside those walls against her will, these same walls were something else entirely. For the Methodist woman who found in the class meeting the first community that had ever treated her spiritual testimony as valuable, that community was liberation. For the woman told by Paul's letters that she must be silent, that her subordination was God's design, those same words were a weight she carried every day. Faith in the 18th century was not simple. It was not a monolith. It was a vast and complicated human landscape, and the women who moved through it did so with the same intelligence and resilience and occasional exasperation that they brought to everything else. Which brings us naturally to the women who moved through the social landscape across the class divide, and discovered that the differences between their lives were in some ways more radical than anyone in power particularly wanted to acknowledge. Because we've been spending a lot of time looking at what was similar across the three tiers of women's experience: the aristocrat, the merchant's wife, the labouring poor. And the similarities are real, but the differences, when you look closely at them, are almost incomprehensibly wide. And the story of how those differences played out day by day in the same society, in the same century, on opposite sides of a street. That story is waiting just ahead. Picture the same street in London, somewhere central, somewhere prosperous, let's say Mayfair in the 1760s on a Tuesday morning in October. On one side, a townhouse with clean stone steps freshly swept, the brass knocker polished to a shine. Inside, a woman in a silk dressing gown is receiving visitors in her dressing room, sipping chocolate from a porcelain cup, while a hairdresser works on the elaborate arrangement of her hair. She will not step outside until afternoon. Her day has not officially begun. On the other side of the same front door, quite literally down a separate staircase behind a door that opens to a different world, a girl of 15 has been awake for 4 hours. She has lit every fire in the house. She has carried water. She has swept the kitchen and the hall. She has emptied the chamber pots. She has polished the brass knocker that will welcome the morning's visitors. She has done all of this before the woman upstairs opened her eyes. 2 women. The same building. The same morning. Worlds apart. This is the class divide in 18th century Europe, and I've been thinking about how to convey it without making it feel abstract. Because the numbers are stark, but it's the daily texture that tells the truth. So let's live inside it for a while. The aristocracy employed on average around 50 servants in their great houses. 50. The middle classes, the merchants, the doctors, the prosperous tradesmen might employ 3 or 4. The majority of their servants in both cases were women. By the early 19th century in England and Wales, close to 900,000 people worked as domestic servants. The overwhelming majority of them were female. In France, in Germany, and the Netherlands, the pattern was the same. Domestic service was the single most common occupation for women who needed to earn wages. It was for most of them the only option available that didn't involve agricultural labour or factory work. And in the 18th century, for a girl from a poor family who had received some education and wanted to be respectable, going into service was genuinely the best she could hope for. Which should tell you something about how limited the alternatives were. Let me be specific about what the life of a female servant actually looked like, because the popular image borrowed from too many period dramas tends toward the picturesque. Neat uniforms, cheerful efficiency, the occasional romantic subplot with a footman. The reality was considerably more grinding. A maid-of-all-work, the most common type of female servant, the one who worked alone or with one other woman in a modest household, typically began her day between 5 and 6 in the morning. Her first tasks were physical and unpleasant. Lighting fires required carrying coal, and coal was heavy and dirty. Heating water required carrying water, and water was heavy. Before the family had finished breakfast, she had swept dusted, emptied chamber pots, lit fires in every room, and made everything presentable. Her workday would continue until 10 or 11 at night. Sometimes later, if there was company. There was no fixed quitting time, there was no concept of overtime, there was simply the work isn't done yet. Her wages in the 18th century in England range from roughly £5 to £10 per year, depending on her position and the wealth of the household. On the face of it, this sounds almost laughably small, and it was. But the calculation was more complicated than it appears, because domestic servants received room and board as part of their compensation. They lived in the household. They were fed from the household's kitchen. They wore clothes supplied or at least partially subsidized by their employer. This arrangement, which sounds like a benefit, was also a form of complete dependency. If you lost your position, you didn't just lose your income. You lost your home. You lost your meals, you had nowhere to go, and positions could be lost with almost no notice and for almost any reason. Here is a legal detail from 1777 that I find particularly illuminating about how power worked in this relationship. In that year, the High Court of England ruled in a case called the Inhabitants of Brampton that a female domestic servant could be dismissed on account of pregnancy. not because she had done anything wrong in the performance of her duties, not because she had been negligent or dishonest, because she was pregnant, and any sexual activity by a female servant, whether it happened inside the master's household or not, whether it was consensual or not, whether she was the person pursuing it or the person subjected to it, was grounds for dismissal, so long as she remained employed in that household. Read that again carefully. Sexual activity by a female servant, including activity she had not chosen and had not invited, could get her dismissed. What this meant in practice was that a servant who was exploited by her employer, or his son, or a male guest of the household, had almost no recourse whatsoever. If she spoke about what had happened, she would almost certainly lose her position. If the result of what had happened was a pregnancy, she would lose her position. If she lost her position without a written character reference, a letter of recommendation from her former employer, she was essentially unemployable in respectable domestic service for the rest of her life. The character reference was in practical terms a leash. It meant that a servant's entire future depended on the goodwill of the person who had the most power over her. I don't want to overstate this into universal victimhood, because that's not accurate either. Many employers were decent people. Many households were genuinely caring environments. The literature of the period includes examples of mistresses who treated their servants with real warmth and respect, who helped them when they were ill, who wept at their marriages. Human beings have always been more complicated than systems, but the system itself was constructed so that the vulnerability ran entirely in one direction. It was the servant who had no protection. It was the employer who had no accountability. The novel Pamela, published by Samuel Richardson in 1740, captures this dynamic with a vividness that scandalized and fascinated its readers in equal measure. Pamela is a young maidservant whose master repeatedly attempts to exploit her, and who preserves her virtue through a combination of intelligence, courage, and a great deal of prayer. The novel was a sensation, read by everyone from aristocrats to tradespeople, discussed in coffee houses, debated in letters, praised by some as a moral triumph, and mocked by others as ridiculous wish fulfillment. What Richardson understood and what made the book resonate so powerfully is that Pamela's situation was not invented. It was simply written down. When a character in the novel cries out, "How came I to be his property?" what right has he in me? Readers recognize the question. Not because they had all been Pamela, but because they all knew someone who had been. The historian who has studied court records from this period found in her words hundreds of what the documents call seductions, a word that then served as a polite code for what we would now describe as assault or coercion. The Old Bailey trial records, which from the 1720s onward began publishing longer and more narrative accounts of cases, include the stories of these women in the few legal spaces where their voices could be heard. I want to be clear about something: most of these stories never reached the courts at all. Most of them were absorbed into silence, into dismissal, into the quiet catastrophe of a young woman thrown out of a household she had lived in for years, with nowhere to go, and a baby she couldn't afford. Thomas Coram established the Foundling Hospital in London in 1739, partly in response to this exact crisis, the number of infants abandoned or lost when their mothers had no means of supporting them. Over 60% of the women who applied to leave children at the Foundling Hospital in its early decades were domestic servants. That statistic is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the power structure I've just described. Now let me complicate this, because the class divide in this story is not only about exploitation, it's also about the strange and intimate relationship between women who were by birth and circumstance on opposite sides of a profound social gulf, and who nonetheless lived in extreme physical proximity and sometimes developed connections of genuine complexity. The lady of the house and her maid shared a building often for years. They knew each other's habits, ailments, moods, secrets. The lady's maid, the most senior of female servants who dressed her mistress, styled her hair, travelled with her, and served sometimes as her confidant, occupied a peculiar position that was neither friend nor equal, but something in between that the era had no clean word for. Some of these relationships were genuinely close, some were merely functional, some were quietly cruel, and the cruelty ran both ways because the mistress who was harsh to her servant and the servant who was resentful of her mistress both inhabited a situation that neither of them had designed and neither of them could easily escape. What I find most poignant is this: the aristocratic or wealthy woman, for all her social privilege and legal disadvantages, did have certain freedoms that the servant did not. She could move through public spaces. She could receive and send visitors. She could express opinions in polite company. She had leisure time, however constrained its uses. She had a name that was recorded in the newspapers and the parish registers and the letter books of her era. The servant had most often nothing of the kind. No public presence, no record outside the household accounts where her wages were tallied. She was in the most literal sense invisible to history, except when she appeared in a court document or a foundling hospital register, or the pages of a novel that imagined what her voice might sound like if anyone had thought to ask. I keep thinking about what it must have taken psychologically to get up every day and do that job, to live inside someone else's house under someone else's rules, in service to someone else's life, and to still find in the margins whatever it was that made your own life feel like yours. And when I dig into the historical record, I find that they did. They did find those margins. The servants' hall, the space below stairs where domestic workers gathered between duties, was a world unto itself. It had its own social hierarchy, its own gossip networks, its own humour. Upper servants lorded it over lower servants with a rigidity that mirrored the world above stairs. The cook and the housekeeper were figures of considerable authority in their own domain, and within the constraints of very little free time, servants maintained friendships, fell in love, wrote letters, read whatever books they could get their hands on, and occasionally left detailed personal memoirs that historians have spent the last several decades recovering from the archives. These voices are extraordinary when you find them. They are not the voices of people who accepted their situations as natural. They are the voices of people who knew exactly what their situation was, and who navigated it with a clarity and a sardonic humour, and occasionally a rage that is completely recognisable across 3 centuries. So here is the question that I want to leave you with as we move forward in this story. We've now seen the full range, the aristocratic French woman receiving visitors at her dressing table, while a small army of servants maintains the world around her. The merchant's wife managing her household and her accounts with brisk efficiency. The peasant woman rising before dawn to feed the animals and spin thread until her hands ache. The servant girl carrying coals up the back stairs in the dark. All of these women share a century. They share a social world, however differently they inhabit it. They share, and this is the part I want to focus on now, a common experience of being defined in the eyes of the law and the culture by their relationship to men. Daughter, wife, servant, widow. Their identities were relational. Their legal existences were dependent. What happens when some of those women decide quietly or loudly, or with extraordinary personal cost, to stand outside that definition and say, I am something that you have not named yet? That's the question that drives the last part of our story. The women who pushed back, the women who said no, the women who, out of their different situations and with their different tools and at enormous personal cost, started making the arguments that the world would eventually, slowly, grudgingly, incompletely have to answer. Their stories are right around the corner. And I'll warn you now, some of them end badly. Some of them end in exile or imprisonment or the guillotine or simple erasure. But the ideas they planted didn't die with them. Ideas almost never do. Take a moment and think about this question, and I want you to sit with it properly before we move on. If you wanted to know how intelligent a woman was in 18th century Europe, what evidence would you look for? You couldn't look at her university degree. Universities did not admit women. You couldn't look at her professional credentials. Most professions were closed to her. You couldn't look at her published work because even women who did write often published anonymously or not at all. You couldn't look at her salary because the work she did most was unpaid. What you could look at, what is still there in the historical record, is the gap between what she was permitted to know and what she clearly knew anyway. And when you look at that gap across the three social classes we've been following through this story, you find something that still has the power to astonish. The gap is enormous in every direction. And it says something profound about what human intelligence will do when you try to dam it. Let's start with education, because the divergence begins there and it never closes. For girls born into the aristocracy in 18th century Europe, formal education was limited by design, not by poverty, by intention. The daughters of nobles were taught to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. They were taught French, which was the language of the European courts, and therefore essential for social navigation. They were taught music, drawing, and dancing, the three accomplishments that signalled refinement without threatening anything. They were taught what one contemporary called the decorative arts. They were not taught Latin, which would have given them access to classical scholarship. They were not taught science, which was considered simultaneously too difficult and too masculine for female minds. They were not taught history or philosophy in any serious way. The implicit logic of aristocratic female education was, you will be a wife and hostess, so we will teach you to be a beautiful and charming wife and hostess, and nothing that complicates that role. The result was a paradox that the women who lived it were very much aware of. Aristocratic women had more leisure time than any other class of women, and leisure is prerequisite for intellectual development. They had access to private libraries that working women could not imagine. They moved in circles where ideas were discussed at the highest levels, and yet the formal intellectual preparation they received was systematically less rigorous than what their brothers got, less rigorous than what European universities were offering, and less rigorous than what their own social position, with its genuine demands of management and diplomacy and influence, actually required. The gap between what they were taught and what they needed created women who educated themselves, who read in secret or in plain sight, who found in the salon, as we've discussed, the university they were never formally admitted to. But self-education under these conditions was always contingent, always dependent on having the time, the books, the access, the permission. Some women had all of these, many had only fragments. For girls in the middle class, the daughters of merchants, doctors, tradesmen, professionals, the educational picture was simultaneously more practical and more constrained. Middle-class girls in the 18th century were educated primarily for one purpose, to make themselves marriageable to a man of their own or higher station. This meant accomplishments the same music and French and needlework as their aristocratic counterparts in slightly less expensive versions. But it also meant something the aristocratic girl's education rarely included: a practical understanding of household management, of accounts of the real economics of running a family. Here is the fascinating distinction. The aristocratic girl was educated to decorate. The middle-class girl was educated to manage. Both were educated for the benefit of a future husband, and neither was educated for herself. But the middle-class education, for all its limitations, produced women who were genuinely capable of running complex household enterprises, who could read contracts and keep accounts and negotiate with suppliers. The practical intelligence that this required was real, and the women who developed it knew it was real, even when no one around them was prepared to call it by its proper name. And then there was the route that opened with bitter irony only to middle-class women who had fallen on hard times. The governess. I want to spend some time here because the governess is one of the most revealing figures in this entire story, and she has been largely left out of it so far. The governess was a woman who occupied one of the most painful social positions in all of European history. She was almost without exception a woman of the middle or occasionally upper middle class, who'd encountered some financial catastrophe, a father's death, a family bankruptcy, a failed business that made it impossible for her to live without earning wages. She was educated, well-spoken, bred to be a lady, and she had, in the economy of the 18th and early 19th century, almost exactly one respectable employment option available to her: teaching other people's children in other people's homes. The definition offered by a Victorian observer describing this figure who had been emerging through the 18th century is one of the most economically precise things ever written about class. The real definition of a governess in the English sense is a being who is our equal in birth, manners, and education, but our inferior in worldly wealth. Read that again. Our equal in birth, manners, and education, our inferior in worldly wealth. The governess was, in other words, a living demonstration that the class system ran on money, not on merit or character or intelligence. She had everything that was supposed to define a lady except the one thing that actually did: financial security. And this made her position in any household she entered almost unbearably ambiguous. She could not eat with the servants because her background was too genteel for that. She could not eat with the family because her employment made her position too subordinate for that. She typically ate alone in a schoolroom, worked with the children throughout the day, spent evenings in solitude because she had no designated social space, and was expected to maintain the bearing of a lady while living in conditions that no lady by birth would have accepted. A writer describing the governess's condition observed that she was too low for the family, too high for the servants, isolated yet having no privacy. The wages were correspondingly humiliating. Charlotte Bronte, who worked as a governess, and who based the experience into one of the most famous novels in the English language, was paid £20 a year in 1841. By any standard of the era, that was a wage that would not have kept a person from the edge of destitution without the room and board that came with it. And here is what strikes me most: these women were not less intelligent than the mistresses they served. In many cases they were more intelligent. They were more rigorously educated. In some respects, necessity had driven them to learn more than decorative accomplishments. They had more fully developed minds, more experience of the world's actual texture, more understanding of what it was to manage under real constraint. And yet, the household hierarchy made no acknowledgement of any of this. The governess's intelligence and education were purchased at the lowest possible rate to benefit someone else's children. Her own situation was precarious, lonely, and almost entirely without legal protection. For the daughters of the labouring poor, the women at the bottom of the social pyramid, formal education was not a limited thing. It was barely a thing at all. In the 18th century, if a girl from a poor family received any schooling, it came most often through the Sunday school movement, which began in England in the 1780s, primarily as a way of teaching reading and basic religious instruction to children who worked 6 days a week. What these schools offered was functional literacy enough to read the Bible, sign a document, follow a basic set of instructions. Not enough to write fluently, not enough to access the growing world of printed books and newspapers that was transforming how educated people understood their world. The working poor girl's education was overwhelmingly practical and transmitted directly from her mother and the women around her. She learned to cook, to mend, to manage a fire, to preserve food, to calculate whether the family's resources could stretch through the winter. She learned the trades that would keep her alive, spinning, weaving, the specific agricultural knowledge of her region, the seasonal rhythms of work that organized everything. This was a body of knowledge that was genuine, specific, and hard-won. It was not written down anywhere. It was not called education by the people who studied education, but it constituted an encyclopedia of practical intelligence that the aristocratic girl with her pianoforte lessons and her French conversation would have been utterly helpless without. Now, and this is the part I want to linger on what happened when these three worlds actually touched, because they did touch, more than the history books suggest. The aristocratic household ran on the labour of people who came from the labouring classes. The governess moved between social worlds every time she changed employment. The market, the church, the street, these were spaces where women of different classes encountered each other every day. And what I find so fascinating about those encounters is the complexity they reveal. The relationship between the aristocratic mistress and her maid was not simply one of power over powerlessness. It was that, certainly. But it was also sometimes genuinely caring. There are letters from aristocratic women expressing real concern for servants who were ill. There are wills leaving money to maids who had served faithfully for decades. There are also, of course, examples of cruelty and indifference that would make your stomach turn. The range of human behaviour was the full range because neither women of privilege nor women of poverty were simple. What was not variable, what was structural and consistent, was who bore the cost of social arrangements that no one had been asked to consent to. Across all three classes in different proportions and in different forms, it was the women. The aristocratic woman who gave her husband heirs she had not chosen to bear for a marriage she had not chosen to make. The governess who sold her education for £20 a year and ate alone in a schoolroom. The working woman whose labour powered the whole economy and whose name no one recorded. Here's something that genuinely surprised me when I started going through the historical health data for this period. You might assume reasonably that aristocratic women in the 18th century had the longest, healthiest lives. They had food, warmth, access to the best physicians, freedom from the physical drudgery that wore labouring women's bodies down. Surely their health advantage over poorer women was enormous. The data is more complicated than that. Historical demographers who have studied 18th century mortality found something they called the peerage paradox. Wealthy aristocratic women, particularly before the mid-18th century, did not have a meaningful survival advantage over women in the general population, and in some measures did worse. The reasons are revealing. Aristocratic women used wet nurses for their infants, which meant they became pregnant again faster because breastfeeding suppresses ovulation. This led to extraordinarily high numbers of pregnancies. One analysis found that 20 pregnancies was not unusual among ultra-wealthy women of this period. 20. Each pregnancy carried its own mortal risk. Each postpartum period was a fresh exposure. The privilege that was supposed to protect these women was in one specific and devastating dimension, literally killing them faster. Meanwhile, labouring women who breastfed their own infants, not from choice but because they couldn't afford wet nurses, had longer intervals between pregnancies, and in this one particular dimension of their health, something closer to protection. Class did not straightforwardly determine survival in the way we might expect. What determined it was a tangle of practices, fashions, knowledge, and circumstances that cut across class lines in ways nobody at the time fully understood. What I keep returning to as I look at these three worlds side by side is the question of what is lost when talent and intelligence are systematically misdirected, suppressed, or simply never given the conditions in which to grow. Every generation of women in this century included must have included women of extraordinary intellectual and creative capacity who lived and died without ever being given a framework in which those capacities could develop into anything recognizable by the world. The daughter of the German peasant who might have been a physician if there had been any path for her to become one, the governess who might have written brilliant books if she had had the time and stability and the cultural permission to try. the aristocratic woman who managed political campaigns from her drawing room, while being denied any formal political role, who might have changed the course of legislation if anyone had been willing to call what she did by its proper name. This is not sentimentality. This is a calculation about what society forfeited by organising itself the way it did. Mary Wollstonecraft understood this clearly. The argument was not only that women deserved rights as a matter of justice, though they did, but that a society that wasted the capacity of half its members was making itself poorer in every sense. The class divide in 18th-century women's lives was real and wide and hard, and it shaped everything. But the thing that cuts across it, the thing that belongs equally to the aristocrat, the governess, the peasant woman, and everyone between, is that the constraint was never the whole story. Every one of these women was more than the role assigned to her. Every one of them found ways, small or large, to be something other than what the system said she was. The aristocratic woman who educated herself past what her tutors thought necessary. The governess who made the schoolroom into a space of genuine learning for herself as much as for her students. The working woman who carried her spindle everywhere so her hands would never be idle, not only because she had to, but because in the rhythm of the work there was something that was hers. None of them chose their circumstances. All of them did something with them. That's the thing I want you to carry from this part of the story. Not the injustice, though. The injustice is real. The response to the injustice. The quiet, persistent, sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes joyful insistence on being fully human within conditions that were designed to prevent exactly that. And if you want to understand what comes next, why the women of the 19th century were able to build the movements they built, make the arguments they made, eventually change the laws they changed, you need to understand what was already there, 3 generations earlier in the lives we've been examining. The seeds were already in the ground. They were just waiting for conditions in which they could finally grow. There is a line that a woman named Olympe de Gouges wrote in 1791, a line so clean and so cutting that I've thought about it nearly every day since I first read it. A woman has the right to mount the scaffold. She must equally have the right to mount the rostrum. The rostrum, the speaker's platform, the place where ideas become public record. She was not speaking metaphorically. She was making the most precise legal argument she could construct, that if the law was willing to execute women for political crimes, which it demonstrably was, then the law could not simultaneously deny women the right to participate in the political life that created those laws. You cannot punish someone for violating rules they had no voice in making, she was saying, and expect that to be called justice. 2 years after she wrote those words, Olympe de Gouges mounted the scaffold. Not the rostrum, the scaffold. Let me tell you who she was, because she deserves more than a footnote. She was born Marie Gouges in 1748 in Montauban, a small town in the south of France, the daughter of a butcher, and by her own account, and probably by legend more than fact, the illegitimate daughter of a local nobleman whose literary gift she believed she had inherited. She was largely self-educated. She married at 16, hated it, and when her husband died, she moved to Paris, renamed herself Olympe de Gouges, and vowed never to marry again. She kept that promise for the rest of her life. In Paris, she became a playwright and activist, a relentless pamphleteer who wrote about everything slavery, which she condemned as founded on greed and blind prejudice, divorce, which she thought should be legalized, maternity hospitals, which she thought the state should fund, the rights of orphaned and illegitimate children, the conditions of the poor. She was against the death penalty. She was against torture. She was against the dehumanization of any group of people for the convenience of any other group of people. When the revolution broke out in 1789, she welcomed it with joy. Finally, she thought, finally the age of reason, finally equality, Finally, the natural rights of human beings would be recognized by law. And then she watched the men of the Revolution write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document of breathtaking moral ambition, genuinely radical by the standards of its time and notice, with growing fury that the word man was not being used as universal. It was being used as man. The Declaration did not mention women except as mothers and dependents. The new French Constitution of 1791 gave the right to vote to all citizens, and then defined citizen as men over 25 who paid taxes. The Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. Women got the fraternity. So Olympe de Gouges sat down and rewrote the Declaration. Article by article, word by word, she mirrored the original document and substituted, "Woman and man are born free and remain equal in rights." She appended a sample marriage contract that called for equal sharing of property. She demanded the vote, education, professional opportunities. She called the exclusion of women from the promises of the Revolution a betrayal of everything the Revolution claimed to stand for. She dedicated the document, and this is the detail that I find either brilliant or spectacularly unwise, depending on how you look at it, to Queen Marie Antoinette, the most hated woman in France at that moment, the woman whom the Revolution had been explicitly built against. Why, because de Gouges argued women must support each other regardless of class. Because Marie Antoinette was a woman in an impossible position, and the hatred directed at her was partly the hatred of people who needed a female body to bear the blame for a male system's failures. Because perhaps de Gouges had a contrarian streak that she could not fully suppress, even when her survival might have depended on it. It infuriated both sides. The monarchists thought she was a revolutionary. The revolutionaries thought she was a monarchist. She was in fact something neither camp had a clean category for a woman, with her own political views answerable to no faction, loyal to no party line, unable to be slotted into someone else's narrative. In the autumn of 1793, during the Reign of Terror, she was arrested. At her trial, the judge refused to allow her a lawyer on the grounds that her prolific writing demonstrated she was capable of defending herself. This is one of the more darkly comic moments in legal history, a woman being denied legal counsel because she was too intelligent to need it. She was convicted of seditious behaviour and attempting to restore the monarchy. On the 3rd of November 1793, Olympe de Gouges went to the guillotine. An anonymous Parisian chronicler recorded her last moments. She approached the scaffold with a calm and serene expression, and her composure and dignity forced even those who had condemned her to acknowledge that such courage had rarely been seen before. She was 45 years old. Her execution was then used explicitly as a warning. At a meeting of the Paris Commune just 12 days later, a representative stood up and reminded a group of politically active women of, in his words, the impudent Olympe de Gouges, who was the first woman to start up women's political clubs, who abandoned the cares of her home to meddle in the affairs of the Republic, and whose head fell beneath the avenging blade. Whose head fell beneath the avenging blade. That is a sentence designed to make women afraid. And it worked. The women's political clubs that had briefly flourished in the early years of the Revolution were suppressed. Women were once again told to go home. Now let me step back for a moment, because I want to be careful here. I don't want to flatten Olympe de Gouges into a simple martyr, because she was considerably more complicated than that, and the complexity is actually more interesting. She was not executed for her feminism. Her judge and her accusers barely mentioned her Declaration of the Rights of Woman. She was executed for her political pamphlets against Robespierre and the Jacobins, and specifically for her refusal to endorse the execution of Louis XVI, which she thought was politically counterproductive and morally wrong. She was a woman with genuinely independent political views who kept insisting on expressing them in a political climate that had decided independent views were dangerous and female independent views were intolerable. The feminism and the political nonconformity were part of the same person, inseparable. What got her killed was not that she was a woman who wanted rights. What got her killed was that she was a person who refused to stop thinking for herself when thinking for herself was becoming a capital offence. The story of women who rebelled in the 18th century is, I find, a study in the different forms that courage takes, and in the wildly different prices those forms can command. Consider Aphra Behn, who is barely within our century, but who casts a long shadow across everything that followed her. Aphra Behn was born around 1640 in England. She was, depending on which account you believe, the daughter of a barber or the daughter of a gentleman. The details of her early life are genuinely obscure, partly because she obscured them herself, partly because she was a woman, and therefore the kind of person history didn't bother tracking carefully. What we know is that she went to South America, specifically to the English colony of Suriname, and that she came back with detailed observations of the people and landscape there that later appeared in her most famous novel. We know that she was employed briefly as a spy for King Charles II, sent to the Netherlands to gather intelligence about a plot against the crown. We know that she was given insufficient money for the mission, ran out of funds, entirely fell into debt, and wrote desperate letters to her handlers pleading for help that did not come. We know she was almost certainly imprisoned briefly for debt upon her return, and then because she needed to eat and because writing was something she could do, she became a playwright. Not an amateur who wrote for the pleasure of it and performed plays in private houses, a professional, writing plays for the commercial London stage, having them performed, receiving payment for them, living on the income. She wrote 19 plays that we know of, produced over 19 years. Her play, The Rover, appeared on the professional London stage every single season from its premiere in 1677 until 1743, more than 60 years of continuous performance. In her own time she was a celebrity, known by name, gossiped about, painted, praised and attacked in equal measure. She also wrote about slavery. Her novella Oroonoko, published in 1688, followed an enslaved African prince with a sympathy and a moral clarity that was genuinely unusual for its time, and which later scholars have credited as an early work in the abolitionist tradition. She wrote about forced marriage and the subordination of women with a frankness that her male contemporaries found scandalous, and that modern readers find startlingly contemporary. Virginia Woolf, writing in the 1920s, said of Aphra Behn, "All women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds." But here is the thing that I want you to notice about Behn's story. She didn't march for anything. She didn't write manifestos. She didn't try to change the legal structure of her society. She simply insisted on living as if she were a person with the right to earn a living by her intellectual work, and she made that insistence stick year after year, play after play, until it became a fact. That is a different kind of radicalism from Olympe de Gouges. Less dramatic, less obviously heroic, but arguably more durable because it created something that outlasted her, a precedent, a proof of concept, a demonstration that a woman could do this and that the world would not end. What strikes me most, looking across the range of women who pushed back against the constraints of the 18th century, is how different their strategies were, and how the strategy each woman chose was shaped not just by temperament, but by everything about her situation, her class, her country, her education, the specific moment in history she happened to inhabit. Olympe de Gouges wrote manifestos and went to the guillotine. Mary Wollstonecraft, whom we've met before, wrote philosophy and died of childbirth fever, her legacy suppressed by the revelation of her private life. Aphra Behn wrote plays and poetry, and refused to apologize for any of it, and survived just barely by making herself useful to people with power. The lesson I keep drawing from all of them is not that one approach was better than the others, it's that there was no safe approach. Every strategy for a woman who wanted to be something other than what the law and the culture said she should be carried real risk. The question was always, which risks are you willing to take, and what are you willing to give up? Some of them gave up everything and changed very little in their own lifetimes, and yet the things they said, the arguments they made, the ground they occupied simply by being there and refusing to be moved, none of that disappeared. Ideas, as I've said before, are astonishingly hard to kill. You can guillotine Olympe de Gouges. You can suppress Mary Wollstonecraft's legacy for 80 years. You can mock Aphra Behn as a punk poetess and dismiss her work as immoral. And still, the words persist. Still, the arguments survive. Still, some young woman, decades or centuries later, opens a dusty book and finds something there that was waiting for her. Now here's what I want you to hold on to as we move toward the final chapter of this story. Everything we've talked about tonight, the marriages and the beauty standards and the labour and the salons and the convents and the rebellions, all of it exists inside a particular century, the 18th. A century that believed it was the age of reason, the age of progress, the age when humanity was finally definitively getting smarter. And in many ways it was. The period produced extraordinary achievements. Science, philosophy, political theory, medicine, art, all of it, advanced in ways that genuinely changed what it meant to be human. But for women, for most women in most places, for most of that century, the progress was agonizingly slow, and the gaps between what was promised and what was delivered were wide enough to swallow lives. The question that remains the one that these women and all the women in this story were asking in different ways and in different languages is, what does it leave behind? What did these women, known and unknown, brilliant and ordinary, defiant and quietly enduring, what did they leave for everyone who came after? That answer is closer than you think, and it's the most important part of everything we've been talking about. We have been travelling together for a long time tonight, through drawing rooms and farmhouses and city markets, through dressing rooms and confessionals and courtrooms, through the lives of women whose names history remembered and the lives of women whose names it forgot, through the century that called itself the Age of Reason while leaving half of humanity outside the door. And I want to take a few minutes now before we put this century to rest to step back from the specific details and look at the whole picture, because I think what emerges when you see it all at once is something more surprising and more beautiful than either a simple story of oppression or a simple story of triumph. It is a story about persistence, about the extraordinary human capacity to build a life inside a space that was never designed to accommodate you. Let me do something I rarely do, which is give you a chain of connections, a thread that runs from the women we've been talking about tonight to the world you're living in right now. In 1791, Olympe de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. Within a year, Mary Wollstonecraft published the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Both documents were largely ignored, suppressed, and ridiculed in their own time. In 1848, 57 years later, a group of women and men gathered in Seneca Falls, New York for the first formal women's rights convention in American history. They produced a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled directly on the American Declaration of Independence, which stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." The historians who later traced the intellectual genealogy of that document found its roots in Wollstonecraft, in de Gouges, in the arguments made by women who had died decades before any of the Seneca Falls delegates were born. 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments. It was mocked in the press. The participants were called radicals, eccentrics, and inevitably unfeminine. It took 72 more years from Seneca Falls before American women won the right to vote. 72 years. Susan Anthony, who devoted 50 years of her life to the suffrage movement, did not live to see the 19th Amendment passed. She died 14 years before women cast their first legal votes in a federal election. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died 18 years before the vote was won. I sit with that for a long time. The idea of spending half a century fighting for something you will not live to see. The idea of dedicating your entire adult life to planting seeds in ground that will only bloom after you're gone. And I think about Olympe de Gouges, who wrote in 1791 that women deserved equality, and Wollstonecraft, who wrote the same in 1792. And all the women before them who had the same thought, but no platform from which to say it. And all the women between them and Seneca Falls who kept the argument alive passed it from hand to hand like a torch in a relay race that lasted a century and a half. What did the women of the 18th century leave us? They left us the arguments. That is the most direct answer. The arguments for women's education, for women's legal equality, for women's right to participate in political life. These were not invented in the 19th century. They were recovered from the 18th, where they had been made and then suppressed, and then made again by different women in different languages in different countries, endlessly refusing to die. They left us the proof of concept. Every aristocratic woman who managed a vast estate, every merchant's wife who ran her husband's business, every guild mistress who trained apprentices and built a trade, every single one of them constituted evidence that the theory of female incapacity was false. They didn't write treatises about it. They just did it. And doing it in plain sight in real life in front of witnesses was its own kind of argument. They left us the vocabulary, words like rights, equality, reason, liberty. These words were being applied to women's situations by women writers in the 18th century. When the suffragists of the 19th century needed language for their cause, they didn't have to invent it. They inherited it. And they left us something more intangible, but perhaps more important than any of these, the demonstration that it was possible to be a full human being under conditions designed to prevent you from becoming one. That the human spirit, particularly as it manifests in women who have historically been told their spirit doesn't count, is an almost indestructible thing. Do you know what I keep coming back to more than anything else? The peasant woman in rural Germany rising before dawn, carrying the spindle with her everywhere, so her hands would not be idle in a single free moment. Spinning thread from first light to last light, year after year, generation after generation, clothing an empire and being remembered by no one. Her labour built the world, and the world she built did not bother to write her name down, and yet she was there, she existed. She had a full interior life, worries and joys, and moments of tenderness with her children, and private thoughts about God and anger at the weather and pride in work well done. She was not nothing. She was not diminished by the fact that history forgot her. She was in every essential sense a complete human being who happened to live in a time that did not yet know how to value what she offered. History is just the story we tell about the people we remember, and the people we remember are almost always the ones who had the power to make sure they'd be remembered. For most of human history, that has not included most women. But the women we've talked about tonight, in their wildly various, sometimes contradictory, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes triumphant ways, they were working on that. They were making sure that some part of the story survived. I want to say something that I mean seriously as someone who has spent a lot of time in this history. The 18th century is not ancient history. The world these women lived in was not as different from ours as we find comfortable to believe. The coverture doctrine, the idea that a married woman has no independent legal existence, was abolished in England only in 1882. In the United States, married women's property rights varied by state well into the 20th century. The marital rape exemption in English law was not removed until 1991. Women in Switzerland did not receive the federal right to vote until 1971. In France, women could not open a bank account without their husband's permission until 1965. The women we discuss tonight, the ones who fought for rights, who made arguments, who suffered consequences for having independent minds, they were not fighting for something that was achieved smoothly and completely. They were firing the opening shots in a struggle that is still in various forms and in various places ongoing. And here is the thing that I think matters most. Those women had no guarantee of success. They could not see the thread that connected their arguments to Seneca Falls or Seneca Falls to the 19th Amendment or the 19th Amendment to what came after. They were working in the dark, making the best arguments they could, insisting on the truth of their own humanity with whatever tools were available to them, and trusting without any particular evidence that the truth eventually finds its way. That is not a naive thing. That is a profoundly courageous thing. Courage does not require certainty. It requires showing up anyway. Here's where I want to leave you tonight. Somewhere in the back of your mind, I hope you now carry a small collection of people who are not in your history textbook. The lace-maker in Bruges whose hands made something beautiful that someone else sold, and whose name no one recorded. Olympe de Gouges approaching a scaffold with the serenity that made her executioners uncomfortable. Madame Geoffrin setting her table for the philosophers whose ideas changed the world, and never receiving a chair in the academy she helped build. The servant girl in a London townhouse rising at 5 a.m. to polish the brass that would welcome visitors who would not see her. Mary Wollstonecraft writing at furious speed about a world she knew might not be ready for her because she couldn't bear not to write it. These are your people, they're your past. Whatever your gender, whatever your background, if you benefit from the idea that human beings deserve to be treated as full and equal persons, you're downstream from these women and the countless unnamed others who held that idea alive through a century that tried very hard to extinguish it. And one more thing before I let you sleep. The question I opened this story with, the one I asked you to keep close, was this: if you had been born a woman in Europe in 1700, with no vote and no legal identity, and no career and no choice about who you married, what would you have done with the interior life they couldn't take away from you? I've been thinking about what the answer is now that we've spent all this time with the people who actually lived it, and I think the answer is exactly what they did. You would have found the spaces between the rules. You would have built things in the margins. You would have kept your own counsel in your own mind even when you couldn't say it aloud. You would have written the letter, or taught the apprentice, or turned the argument inside out until it said something true. You'd have, on the days when the weight of it was heaviest, gotten up anyway and done the next thing, because that is what people do in every era under every kind of constraint. They persist, they insist, they carry the torch. The century is over now. The women in this story have been quiet for 300 years, but the things they said are still in the air, still circulating, still finding their way into the minds of people who need them. I hope tonight you found a few. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me and with these extraordinary, complicated, endlessly fascinating women of 18th century Europe. This story has been living inside me for a long time, and getting to share it with you, really share it across all the hours of it in all its detail and its difficulty and its occasional moments of dark comedy, that has been one of the most satisfying things I've done on this channel. If something tonight moved you or surprised you or made you think about something you hadn't thought about before, please tell me in the comments. I genuinely read them, and the conversations that happen down there are often more interesting than anything I've said up here. And if you are new here, welcome. This is what we do. We take the people that history forgot to celebrate and we sit with them for a while. We treat their lives as worth understanding. We try to learn what they had to teach. There are more of those people waiting. More centuries, more stories, more rooms that history sealed shut and that we get to open together. The next one is coming, and I promise you it is not what you expect. Until then, rest well. Think of those women, and thank you genuinely for listening.